While helping some ants in a fight, we see that he accidentally discovered the entrance to a miniature world, where a single egg he dropped fed 50 villagers for 3 days. As a result, the people there worship him like a god, and he sends them food daily until, quite by accident, he rescued a mother and daughter and discovered the truth. This miniature world was actually the world of the Min dynasty, found inside a sandbox within an anthill. Excited, he brought it home and found people the size of dust. At that moment, a young woman was holding a bamboo basket, gathering grass and tree bark from the sandy earth, occasionally finding a few green leaves from wild vegetables. Suddenly, men holding rusted swords ran toward the village, shouting for everyone to listen and hand over all their food to their leader, an old bandit. Otherwise, he threatened to kill every last one of them with a single blow. Immediately after, the young woman's door was kicked open, and she and her mother were seized. They were dragged outside, both crying and screaming for mercy, pleading with the great king because they truly had nothing left to eat in their home. Imagine the scene. Their family was reduced to eating grass roots, but the bandits didn't care at all, looking at the young woman with pure malice. The old bandit threatened to cut her down if the food wasn't delivered. The young woman wept as her mother rushed to embrace her, begging for her life. With a strike, red liquid splashed in the distance, and as he swung his sword toward the girl, our protagonist truly couldn't restrain himself and opened the model box. He reached into the box and flicked his finger. Meanwhile, in Gao village during the Min dynasty, a giant hand suddenly stretched down from the clouds in the sky. The young Gao Yi felt the sunlight being blocked and looked up through her tears to see a massive hand reaching rapidly toward her from above. With a flick of that giant hand, the bandit swinging his sword was sent flying past Gao Yi, soaring through the sky toward the sandy earth outside the village. He landed with a dull thud, his bones completely shattered, while a faint sound of wind and thunder echoed in the sky against the cursed bandits. The hand retreated into the clouds and vanished, leaving Gao Yi so stunned she forgot to cry, staring up at the sky in complete disbelief. Seeing their comrades suddenly fly away, the other bandits gathered and approached the girl's house, demanding to know what she had just done. Gao Yi hugged her mother's body and shook her head in confusion, but the bandit chief stepped forward with his rusted sword, threatening to make her talk. In the next moment, the bandit chief screamed and vanished instantly, leaving the remaining bandits shocked as they began to roar at Gao Yi in a mix of rage and panic. It was then she realized only she could see the giant hand. Looking up at the opening in the clouds, she saw the vague shape of a man's face. It was as if a god were watching the world, so she left her mother's side and knelt toward the heavens, praying for the celestial god to save them. Thunder rumbled as if something were falling from the heavens, and the bandits fled in terror, only for a massive palm to drop from the sky a moment later, crushing them all. They were flattened into the earth, and as silence returned to the model box, the doors of the village's dilapidated houses creaked open as the residents cautiously stepped outside. They gathered around the bandits he had just crushed, whispering softly while constantly glancing at the sky, as some approached the young villager to ask her what had happened. Their voices sounded like the faint buzzing of mosquitoes, impossible to hear clearly unless they shouted. Soon, however, the villagers were busy stripping the bandits of their weapons and clothes. Each family received a weapon before they spent the night digging a pit outside the village to bury the bodies, even carving wooden headstones for their own fallen neighbors. It seemed no one in the village knew how to read, as not a single word was written on the markers, only crooked notches carved with a knife to identify each family. The young woman knelt before one of the graves, bowing her head in grief with tears in her eyes, while our protagonist watched in silence for a long time before finally resting. The next morning, after waking up and boiling 2 eggs, he returned to the model box to find the villagers already at work, with the young girl carrying her bamboo basket. She was searching for grass roots in the sandy soil outside the village. She had lost her mother only yesterday and surely hadn't recovered, yet she already had to find food. Gao Yi had been searching this barren land for half the day, and we see her hands and feet growing weaker as her small body begins to tremble from exhaustion. She didn't know how much longer she could last before starving, but she felt that day drawing closer. At that moment, a sigh echoed from the clouds. The girl was suffering greatly. Hearing the voice, Gao Yi snapped her head up and saw the face of a young man emerging from the clouds. Sensing she was saved, she bowed piously once more. She pleaded with the celestial god, telling him she was so hungry she couldn't bear it, begging for mercy and salvation like a helpless little animal waiting in silence. She waited for the grace of the celestial god, but after a while, nothing happened. Looking up, she saw that the face in the clouds had vanished without a trace. She wondered if the great god was unwilling to help her, perhaps only intervening yesterday to kill those unforgivable bandits on a whim. After all, gods have their own business. If the gods answered every request, she reasoned, there wouldn't be such suffering. Besides, she had offered nothing in return, so she gritted her teeth and kept searching for roots. Meanwhile, our protagonist had stepped away from the landscape box and into the kitchen, where the fire was burning and the water in the pot had reached a rolling boil. The The 2 eggs he had dropped in were nearly cooked. He took one in his hand and approached the box, where the little maiden was still diligently searching the sandy ground. He decided to try and give her something to eat. The girl suddenly stiffened and looked at the sky, her eyes wide with surprise as the clouds parted above her. A giant hand reached down and placed a massive egg on the sandbank right in front of her, leaving Gao Yi staring forward with her mouth open in absolute wonder. To her, it looked like the egg of some ancient, giant beast. Terrified, she took a few steps back, wondering with utter disbelief if this massive object truly was an egg. He told her it was for her to eat and that he had already boiled it for her. Hearing the great god's kind words, Gao Yi finally summoned her courage. She approached and tapped the shell, which sounded as solid as a giant rock, so she picked up a stone and used all her strength to strike it. When she hit the shell, the stone shattered while the egg remained completely unharmed. Seeing that the shell was harder than rock, our protagonist could only smile awkwardly. He gently told her he would help her peel it, and after removing the shell, he placed the egg back before the little maiden, whose eyes went wide at the sight. It really was a hard-boiled egg, though it was impossibly large, over 3 meters long, and Gao Yi could only stare with her mouth open before suddenly lunging at the snowy white surface. It was delicious, a luxury she believed only the sons of wealthy landowners ever tasted, and now she had one so large she could finally eat until she was full. Gao Yi took several bites, leaving a large hole in the egg white until the yolk was revealed. She then buried her entire head inside, hungrily devouring the center. She made sounds of pure satisfaction as she ate, and we see our protagonist feeling happy that he could finally provide for this poor girl, though he did have one concern. He wondered if the egg was perhaps too large for her to finish. It was July, after all, and if left out overnight, the food would surely spoil and go to waste. Just as he thought this, the girl knelt and bowed in gratitude to the celestial god before finding the strength to run back toward the village. Before long, all 42 residents of the village had gathered around the enormous egg, which stood before them like a small house. If not for the hole where the yolk was clearly visible, they wouldn't have dared to approach. The village chief, Gao Jia, stood at the front, his face full of doubt. He asked if this massive gift truly came from the celestial god, and Gao Yi nodded toward the sky, confirming it was the same deity who had saved them yesterday. The people of Gaojia village looked at one another, still haunted by the shocking and bloody scene they had witnessed the previous day. At the time, only Gao Yi claimed to have seen a celestial hand reach down from the clouds to strike the bandits dead in a single blow. The villagers hadn't known whether to believe her or not, but now, only a day later, she had returned with an egg that defied all logic. Looking at the egg that was as large as a house, the village chief sighed, realizing that only a great god could create something so magnificent. He reasoned that even if such an egg existed naturally, there wouldn't be a pot on earth large enough to cook it, and the others nodded in silent agreement. It seemed the celestial god favored Gao Yi specifically, revealing himself only to her while the others were deemed unworthy of such a divine encounter. A bit surprised that the great god favored her so specifically, the village chief asked if there were any other instructions, and Gao Yi quickly explained that they were all meant to eat. The village chief gestured toward the massive egg, declaring that since it was a gift for everyone, they should eat, though he strictly forbade anyone from stealing more than their share. He ordered a large piece to be divided for every household to take home, though he wasn't quite sure what to do with the massive amount that would surely be left over. The villagers simply couldn't move at all, and our protagonist, realizing the food would spoil in the village heat, decided to reach into their world and intervene once more. He picked up the remaining egg pieces and tossed them into his own trash bin. The villagers, seeing the leftovers fly back into the heavens, were so terrified they nearly fainted. After recovering from the shock, they knelt on the ground to worship the sky and thank the great god for his gift, and soon, Gaojia village returned to its usual calm. The little people began their search for food again. Even though they had just eaten their fill, they knew hard-boiled eggs wouldn't last, and they worried for tomorrow's survival. Watching the little ones from outside their world, our protagonist felt a swirl of mixed emotions. He realized that a single egg, no matter how large, simply wasn't enough for them. Eating only eggs would lead to malnutrition, wouldn't it? He decided he must occasionally provide rice, vegetables, and perhaps even a bit of meat to keep them healthy. And salt. Of course, humans can't survive without salt, and these little people are human too, right? As he thought it through, the situation was becoming rather complicated. He calculated that feeding these 42 little people would only cost him a few yuan a month. It was a small price to pay, and he could certainly afford to keep them. He decided to commit to raising them, but when he searched the internet for advice on how to care for people from a miniature country, he found absolutely no answers. He turned to his usual military and history forums, posting anonymously to ask what others would do if they found a group of tiny people. Unfortunately, the replies were less than helpful. Some suggested rather inappropriate things, leaving him utterly speechless. It seemed there was no point in trying to reason with such a group of useless idiots. It appeared he would have to learn everything from scratch. After checking the diorama to ensure the little ones were safe for the moment, he hurried out of his house. He ran to the nearest supermarket and loaded up on a sack of rice, 2 cuts of pork, a bag of vegetables, and a large package of salt, spending just over 100 yuan. Returning home, he located Gao Yi's small house and, using his hand like a funnel, aimed carefully toward the window of the young maiden's tiny dwelling. He poured a handful of rice very, very slowly until it filled half her room. Then, he clapped his hands together and waited cheerfully for her to return home. She would be so happy to see all that rice, wouldn't she? Meanwhile, we see Zhang Yao sitting in the county magistrate's hall, frowning at the account books provided by his secretary. With a look of pure disgust, he noted that the back taxes from the villages still hadn't been collected, and his superiors were beginning to put a great deal of pressure on him. The secretary rushed to offer a flattering smile, explaining that with the great drought in Shaanxi and the land parched for miles, the people simply had no means to survive. He argued that the peasants truly had no grain left, but Zhang Yao wasn't buying it, insisting that those rascals were just hiding their harvest to avoid paying rent. The secretary looked quite uncomfortable as he listened to the magistrate complain that while grain was always collected in previous droughts, suddenly this year, it was impossible. The official pointed out that in the first year of drought, people have reserves, and by the second, they can still barely manage to pay their taxes. But by the third year of continuous drought, people are literally dying. We have to wonder where he expects them to find money or grain at such a point. Zhang Yao glared at him, asking suspiciously how much he had been bribed to defend those peasants and dare whisper such nonsense into an official's ear. Startled, the secretary pleaded that he hadn't received a single cent, simply because the people were so poor they had nothing left to offer as a bribe. He felt he had no choice but to speak up for them, but Zhang Yao merely snorted at this attack of conscience and stopped paying him any attention. Deciding that such rascals required a ruthless hand, he ordered the bailiffs to give them a deadly beating, a rather extreme solution, to be perfectly honest. The secretary was horrified, warning that if the magistrate continued to pressure the suffering people this way, he would surely drive them toward a rebellion. Ignoring the warning, the magistrate dismissed the man. Meanwhile, we return to the village where Gao Yi arrived home, feeling utterly exhausted. But the moment she unlocked her door, a massive amount of oval white rice, each grain over half a meter wide, came tumbling out toward her. She stood there stunned, staring foolishly at the giant grains, and just as she was wondering what was happening, she saw a faint image in the sky. It was the face of the great celestial god looking down with a smile before he vanished once more behind the clouds. Before long, all 42 villagers gathered in front of Gao Yi's house, staring at the enormous rice grains in a state of total collective confusion. After a moment, the village chief remarked that this must be another blessing, as no rice this large exists in the natural world. Gao Yi nodded, explaining that the great god had played a little joke on her by filling her house so full of rice that it flooded out when she opened the door. The village chief joked that he hoped for such pranks every day, while young Gao Chugu hugged a grain of rice and wondered how they would divide it all. The chief shouted at him to put it back, worried that if they took the rice without knowing if it was meant for everyone, the great god might crush them like bandits. Terrified, Gao Chugu dropped the rice immediately, and the village chief turned back to Gao Yi, speaking to her with newfound kindness. Since the great celestial god chose to appear only to her, the chief asked Gao Yi to speak with him and find out if they might all share in this divine light. Just as he was speaking, a haughty voice suddenly echoed from the village entrance, shouting for the despicable peasants of Gao village to come out at once. The voice demanded they stop hiding in their houses and pay the taxes they owed to the imperial court. Immediately, the faces of every villager turned pale. Even the small children covered their mouths in fear, not daring to cry, as someone whispered that the county bailiffs had finally arrived. The village chief acted quickly, ordering the young men to move all the rice into Gao Yi's house and lock the door while he went to stall the officials. He warned them that the bailiffs must not see the rice. Meanwhile, looking down at our diorama, we see 5 tiny new officials appearing on the scene. These new figures seem to be arguing with the villagers, and as we lean in closer, we can hear one of the officials shouting at the crowd. He accused the commoners of rebellion for withholding taxes, while another official paced around brandishing an iron ruler as a clear threat. He threatened to throw them all in jail, prompting the village chief to approach with a subservient smile, pleading that they simply had no money or food left. He pointed out that they were all starving because not a drop of rain had fallen in months, but the official merely mocked him, claiming the drought was no excuse. The official insisted that government grain must be delivered regardless of the circumstances, or it would be considered an act of open rebellion. With a look of pure bitterness, the chief begged the man to look at his people, so emaciated and malnourished that a gust of wind could knock them over. He insisted there was no way to pay, but the official decided to search the village himself, warning that anyone hiding grain would rot in a prison cell. He shoved the village chief aside and strutted into the village. It is a classic scene of officials oppressing good people, and it is honestly quite infuriating to watch. A strange feeling began to stir in our observer's heart, suggesting that this box is far more complex than he originally imagined. As the 5 officials began their search, the village chief grew visibly tense. Usually, the peasants have nothing to hide, but today, one house is overflowing with rice. If the collectors find that giant white rice, the village is doomed, but as is often the case, the more nervous one feels, the more they give themselves away. The tax collectors noticed immediately that the villagers' eyes were fixed on one particular ruined house, as if something shameful were hidden inside. All the young men were standing in front of that specific house, with 2 of them even bracing the door with their backs, as if afraid of what might burst out. Naturally, the moment they saw such a suspicious display, the collectors' attention was locked firmly onto that ruined house. One of the tax collectors approached Gao Ye's house, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Immediately, a wave of nervous energy swept through the villagers as they watched him get closer. Their expressions shifted instantly, and the village chief instinctively stepped forward to block the official's path. The collector barked at him to get out of the way, shoving the old man so hard that he stumbled and fell to the ground. The officials then rushed toward the house, shouting at the young men who were still guarding the entrance. They ordered them to move aside. Several of the young men clenched their fists in anger, but none dared to actually strike back. When no one moved, the collectors simply kicked them, forcing them out of the way with brute strength. The wooden door was damp and fragile, completely unable to withstand the pressure being forced against it. Suddenly, the rice from inside came pouring out, giving the lead collector a massive fright as he scrambled backward as fast as he could. He stood there, utterly stunned, as he stared at grains of rice the size of grinding stones. The other 4 collectors were just as shocked, their mouths hanging open in disbelief at the sight. The entire scene fell into an eerie, heavy silence as everyone processed what they were seeing. After several long seconds, one of the collectors stammered out a question, asking if Gao Village had been hiding something like this all along. He realized it was rice, but he couldn't understand what was happening or why the grains were so impossibly large. Seeing an opening, the village chief took a desperate gamble and spoke up. He explained that this was a gift from the great celestial god, sent specifically to save their lives. He warned them that if they dared to touch it, the celestial god would surely take their lives in return. The 5 collectors glanced at one another, caught in that awkward space between skepticism and genuine fear. The situation remained at a complete standstill for nearly a minute as no one knew how to proceed. Not a single word was spoken, and our observer watched the tense standoff in total silence. Our observer wasn't sure if he should intervene, wondering if protecting his 42 little ones meant reaching out to kill these 5 tax collectors, just as he had done with the bandits. But he questioned if such an act was truly appropriate, or where these 5 officials had even come from in the first place. He looked at the box, wondering how they had entered and if there were other little people out there. Would more of them enter the box in the future? There were still so many things he simply didn't understand. Intervening blindly at this moment, he told himself, might not be the optimal solution. He thought for a moment and, naturally, decided to take a photo with his phone first. Then, a massive hand began to hover directly over the box. If his little people were in danger, he was ready to reach in and act. He was prepared to wipe out these 5 tiny foreign officials, just as he had finished off those little bandits. Down below, seeing the enormous hand appearing vaguely in the sky, Gao Yi began to panic. He knew exactly what it meant when the celestial god raised his hand like that. Only yesterday, he had witnessed the celestial god crush an entire group of bandits into pulp with a single slap. That terrifying and yet strangely satisfying image was still fluttering vividly in his mind. Gao Yi quickly raised his head and shouted toward the heavens, begging the celestial god to stop. He pleaded for their lives, explaining that these men were government officials. If they were killed, he feared their entire village would be finished. The villagers were left stunned by his outburst, and the 5 officials were equally bewildered. Then, all at once, they looked up at the sky, wondering what on earth this could possibly mean. This villager was screaming at the clouds not to kill them, but they saw nothing in the sky that could pose a threat. To the 5 of them, the sky was perfectly empty, and they could see absolutely nothing at all. They weren't fools, of course. They immediately recalled what the village chief had said moments ago, but in the very next second, their attitude shifted. The lead official let out a mocking little laugh and cursed, dismissing the whole thing as utter nonsense. Another official joined in, admitting that for a moment, he had actually been given quite a scare. He told himself he had genuinely believed there was something up there coming to kill him. It turns out, he realized, they were just a bunch of wretches putting on an act, and he wondered if they really thought he was so easily frightened. One of the officials turned and shouted at Gao Yi, asking what kind of nonsense she was screaming about. He reminded her that threatening government officials was the same as opposing the imperial court itself. He asked if she had a death wish, but she insisted she wasn't threatening them at all. In her mind, she was saving them, and she pleaded with them to leave as quickly as possible. She warned them that the celestial god had already raised his hand in judgment. They had infuriated him, she explained, and if they continued, he would crush them all with a single slap. The lead official had heard enough and ordered his men to seize that deceitful woman at once. He wanted her taken to the county seat so they could interrogate her slowly and thoroughly. He even suspected she might be a heretic from the White Lotus sect, a serious accusation, to be sure. One official brandished an iron ruler in his hand, ready to carry out the order. He began to walk slowly toward Gao Yi, who glanced at the approaching man before looking back up at the sky. And here we see the clouds part as the hand of the celestial god moves rapidly downward. Before long, that massive shadow was hovering directly over the official's head. It was becoming quite obvious that the celestial god was intent on protecting her. If this official dared to attack her, the god would surely flatten him with a single blow. It would have turned the official into pulp, but we must remember that government officials are not quite the same as common bandits. Killing bandits is one thing, but killing these men would mark the villagers as rebels, and the army would surely leave them with nowhere to be buried. Gao Yi ignored the approaching officer, lifting her head toward the sky and continuing to plead with all her heart. But no, he heard the young woman's call and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He realized that behind these 5 minor officials stood an endless line of even more officials. Their very identity represented the massive power of the state standing right behind them. This diorama box, it seemed, was not nearly as simple as it appeared to his eyes. So, this time, he decided to act exactly according to the young woman's expectations. He withdrew the hand that had originally planned to crush the officials into the dirt. Instead, he simply extended 2 fingers and gently pinched the official, as one might a small insect. The official began to scream with a sound like a pig being led to the slaughter. He felt a massive force seizing his shoulder, pressing down until it felt as though every bone in his body might crumble. He looked frantically to his left and right, trying to see what was clutching him, but there was absolutely nothing there. He could feel only the crushing weight of an invisible, irresistible force. The other 4 officials looked up together, watching their companion struggling helplessly in midair. Their faces were filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated shock. Seeing this divine display, the villagers fell to their knees in perfect unison. The great god had finally manifested, and the official suspended in the air was so terrified that tears and snot ran down his face while his pants became quite soaked. He thrashed his head as he was lifted higher and higher, the ground falling away beneath his feet. As he rose further into the sky, the official screamed with every bit of strength he had left, "Great God, have mercy! Great God, have mercy! This little one had no intention of offending you," he cried out. "This little one was wrong. Please, have mercy." The other 4 officials looked at each other, paralyzed, until he decided to puff out his cheeks and blow a single breath toward them. A sudden, violent gust of wind rose up, targeting only those 4 and leaving everyone else completely untouched as it swept them away. They were sent flying backward together, tumbling 3 or 4 meters before hitting the ground, so hard they nearly split in 2. Finally understanding what was expected of them, they scrambled up only to drop to their knees, slamming their foreheads into the yellow sand. He commanded Gao Yi to tell them to leave and keep silent, and she shouted, "The great god warns you to go and never speak of this." They nodded frantically, promising to obey the great god's instructions before running off, while the official still hanging in the air wailed piteously. He begged to be released, swearing he wouldn't breathe a word, and so, he finally loosened his grip to watch them leave. We see him watching closely, curious to see exactly how these 5 tax collectors would manage to exit Zoan village in such a pathetic state. They reached the edge of the village and walked forward as if the glass wall didn't even exist, simply vanishing without a trace. It was as if that glass barrier served as a sort of portal to an entirely different world. Having personally witnessed these tiny outsiders enter and leave the village, he found himself at a crossroads. He couldn't help but fall into a moment of deep, quiet reflection. He realized he needed to re-examine Zoan village. Perhaps it wasn't just a home for 42 people, but a bridge to another realm. Initially, he thought he was just looking after a small box of tiny people. He had planned to care for them casually, much like one might look after a cage of hamsters, really. To be honest, he had never seriously considered investigating the true nature of these little beings. But if he was truly looking down upon an entire world from above, the situation changed completely. There were suddenly many things that, as it turns out, were very much worth investigating. We return our gaze to the villagers, those tiny little people. By this point, the little tax collectors had already fled the scene. The villagers gathered together, cheering and bowing deeply toward the sky. Gao Yi, being the only one who could speak with the great celestial god, was quickly surrounded by her neighbors. They spoke to her in a hurried rush, and so the young girl raised her head to shout toward the heavens. She thanked the great god for his help on behalf of all her fellow villagers. But they also had a question. Were these delicacies meant as a reward for her alone? They wanted to know if the rest of the villagers were permitted to enjoy them as well. Our protagonist fixed his gaze on the young girl. He realized that she was his only direct link to this tiny world. Since she could hear him, he could use her to finally understand the nature of this miniature land. It seemed the time had come to say a few words to his little messenger. He spoke, telling her to share everything with the others. Furthermore, he mentioned that he had several questions he wanted to ask her. The young girl was overjoyed, telling the villagers that the great god had granted the feast to everyone. Everyone was invited to share, and the little villagers erupted in a sudden, jubilant cheer. They cried out for the great god to bless them, wishing him a long and prosperous life. He then commanded them to be silent, as it was time for his questions. Gao Yi hurriedly shouted for everyone to be quiet. She explained that the great celestial god still had matters he wished to discuss with her. As soon as she shouted this, everyone fell silent in an instant. He asked what planet or continent they were on, but the tiny young girl didn't understand. She repeated his phrase word for word, relaying it to all the villagers, the little people. But none of the little men present understood, not even the village chief, the wisest and most experienced among them. What exactly is a planet? Their faces gave them away. They had no idea what those terms meant. He began to understand that while they shared the same culture, their level of knowledge was quite different. It seemed they had been stuck in time for hundreds of years. He then asked what country they were in and what year it was, as the little men did have a slight idea of what a country was. They knew they were within one, and that this country had an imperial court and an army, but as for its name, they were lost. And as for what era they were living in, they didn't have the slightest clue. They shook their heads in unison, causing our protagonist to frown. He realized these people didn't even know which country they belonged to or what year it was. This was illiteracy on a completely different level, a superior level, one might say. But thinking it over, it made sense. Ancient peasants were often uneducated. They never left their village, and the furthest they ever traveled was to the nearby town. They knew nothing of the outside world, which made him let out a long, weary sigh. He decided to drop it, figuring he wouldn't get any useful information out of them. The villagers looked at one another nervously, and Gao Yi spoke up to address her neighbors. She told them it seemed the celestial god was very disappointed in them. The village chief spoke with a sense of helplessness, admitting they simply couldn't answer his questions. Of course he is disappointed, the chief lamented, wondering what they could possibly do to fix this. After thinking it over quite seriously, the village chief told Gao Yi to speak to the celestial god. He wanted her to ask for a little time to find a solution and, more importantly, to find someone educated. But an educated person? The chief admitted there was no such person to be found in their village. There might be no one in Gao village, but we learned that the nearby town is a different story. The chief recalled the most learned man he had ever seen, the district magistrate himself. Gao Yi was about to shake her head in doubt, thinking of the high-ranking magistrate. How on earth are we going to get a man like that to come here? The chief wondered aloud. He then suggested a more modest goal. Perhaps they could invite the magistrate's secretary instead. Gao Yi shook her head again. Deep down, she knew they couldn't simply invite the secretary either. The village chief smiled, noting that while the secretary was important, he wasn't quite like the magistrate. The magistrate, after all, always had a small army of officers at his beck and call. It would be much easier to fetch the secretary, so the chief turned to a young man nearby. He called out to the youth, a boy named Chugu. Gao Chugu stepped forward, wearing a rather silly, simple smile on his face. The chief gave his orders. Early tomorrow morning, Chugu was to take some of the village youths with him. He told them to eat plenty of white rice and fill their stomachs so they'd have the strength for the journey. Their mission was simple: bring the counselor, Gao, back to Gao village. If the man was willing to come, they were to invite him with the utmost respect. And if he wasn't willing, well, they were told to simply knock him unconscious and drag him back. Remember, the chief reminded them, our lives were given to us by the great celestial god. He insisted that since their lives belonged to the deity, they must deliver the counselor into his venerable hands. They simply could not afford to disappoint him, a thought that left Gao Chugu standing there with his mouth wide open. How delicious, the boy exclaimed, feeling as though the celestial god had personally rewarded him with a giant egg. He felt rewarded by the white rice as well, and promised to follow every instruction once the arrangements were made. With a decisive motion, the village chief waved his large hand to signal the next step. Distribute the rice, he commanded, wanting everyone to finally eat until they were completely full. We see 42 villagers forming a long line in front of Gao Yi's house to receive their share. One by one, each person received a wooden bowl overflowing with precious white rice. To be honest, a portion like this was enough to feed an entire family for many days. Even after all 41 other villagers had been served, a massive pile of rice still remained inside Gao Yi's home. There were clearly many portions left over, yet not a single soul dared to complain that Gao Yi had received too much. In the minds of these simple, superstitious villagers, Gao Yi's status had become equivalent to that of a living saint. And a saint, as we know, is considered both sacred and completely beyond reproach. Soon, every household began boiling water, eager to finally cook the rice they had been given. Imagine the sight, every home with a wooden bowl filled to the brim with pure white rice. However, they didn't dare cook the whole grains all at once. That would be far too extravagant. They chose to crush the rice first, knowing that even a dozen fragments were enough to satisfy the whole family. To eat a full meal of nothing but pure white rice felt like an impossible luxury to them. And so, they cautiously cooked only half of what was needed to truly fill their stomachs. They mixed the rice with wild vegetables, tree bark, and grass roots. In this way, a single meal of white rice could be stretched into two. We see him using a magnifying glass through the window to peer into the pot. He watched the jumbled mess of ingredients they were currently cooking. He couldn't help but shake his head in disbelief at the sight. He had clearly already given them food, yet he wondered what on earth they were cooking. He asked himself how any body could stay healthy eating such things. It was clear that they were being far too thrifty for their own good. He decided it would be better to add something else, and was about to grab a piece of pork. He intended to place it in the scene, but after thinking it over, he realized he couldn't. If he gave rich food directly to people who had suffered from hunger for so long, it would be like a medicine that's too strong. Their stomachs likely wouldn't adapt. In their weakened state, a simple case of diarrhea could actually kill them. He told himself to stop and decided he would gradually adjust their diet instead. The very food he looked down upon was already a rare delicacy for the villagers of Gao. And so, the villagers happily finished cooking their dinner. They no longer felt the need to hide from their neighbors just to eat. After all, everyone was eating exactly the same thing. We returned to an atmosphere reminiscent of the days before the disaster. The village felt much more alive, as it had been a long time since they tasted such good rice. Our scene continues with the village chief, who was sitting in front of his house, quietly eating his rice. He thought to himself that this divine rice was incredibly fragrant, far more so than anything they had ever grown themselves. It was no surprise to him, really, considering it was a gift from the great god. Nearby, we see Gao Chubu, clutching a large bowl and struggling to serve himself more rice. This young man is quite large in stature, and naturally, he eats much more than the others. While an entire family might share just 10 grains of broken rice, he was a different story entirely. He was devouring his portion as if those few grains were the most precious things on earth. He ate as if he hadn't seen food in several lifetimes. It was almost frightening to watch him swallow it all down. Meanwhile, Gaoi sits dazed on the threshold, chewing her food with agonizing slowness. A single mouthful of rice takes her half the day to finish, and as she eats, the tears begin to fall. She mourned that her mother couldn't enjoy this gift, and as she finished her meal, the sky gradually began to darken. The villagers, looking like tiny figures from above, returned to their small houses to find some rest. He finally pulled his attention away from the landscape box, stretched lazily, and turned on his phone. After that, he opened the military history forum he usually frequents and posted the photo anonymously. He asked the community to take a look at the image, noting that the place was called Gao Village. He pointed out the girl, Gao Yi, and the young man named Gao Chubu. He also mentioned the 5 officials, asking the forum members what they made of the scene. To him, the attire of these officials looked exactly like that of servants from the Ming dynasty. Even the names, Gao Yi and Gao Chubu, had a distinctly Ming dynasty ring to them. Indeed, he had realized almost immediately that he was looking at a piece of the Ming dynasty. It was a pity, he thought, that he couldn't see the specific year. This landscape box was truly well crafted, a masterpiece of detail. The little people were incredibly realistic, faithfully restoring every detail of the era. We see a scene of Ming dynasty servants oppressing good people, captured with haunting precision. The responses he received on the forum were beginning to surprise him more and more. He wondered if he was really in Fuxamen Park on July 13, 2023, in the city of Xiaoshuan. It was 7 in the morning, and the temperature had already climbed to 33 degrees. If it was this hot now, he worried the midday sun might be absolutely lethal. Li Dixuan rose from his bed in a daze, still shaking off the remnants of sleep. The first thing his eyes landed on was the landscape box sitting right next to his bed. This box had originally been by the door, and later, he had moved it into the living room. Last night, before sleeping, he had moved it beside his bed and computer just to see it first thing. At first glance, everything inside the box seemed perfectly normal, or as normal as it could be. The little people had already climbed out of bed to begin their day. We see Gao Chubu with some of the younger villagers. They are eating a very hearty breakfast. Today, they were planning to head to the county seat to hire an advisor. Naturally, they needed to eat well if they were going to put in a hard day's work. The village chief stood nearby, watching them closely and giving them instructions word by word. As for the rest of the villagers, they were carrying bamboo baskets, preparing to forage for wild vegetables. Watching them, Li Dixuan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of concern for their well-being. These little people spend every single day searching for wild vegetables, tree bark, and grass roots just to stay alive. Is there really no change at all? Well, he supposed he understood why. They were doing everything in their power just to survive, leaving them no time to think of anything else. And so, we begin today's feeding. He knew that if he provided food daily, their survival anxiety would naturally fade. Only then would they finally have the luxury of thinking about other things. Li Dixuan opened his refrigerator and tore off a leaf from the Chinese cabbage he had bought just yesterday. The cabbage leaf was quite large, at least 40 centimeters long and 10 centimeters wide. He returned to the landscape box and gently placed the massive leaf right in front of Gao Yi. At that moment, Gao Yi was carrying her bamboo basket, preparing to leave the village in search of wild greens. Suddenly, a giant hand reached down from the heavens, depositing an enormous leaf of Chinese cabbage. Standing before it, Gao Yi stared up at the towering vegetable. To her, it was a massive structure, 30 centimeters long and 10 centimeters wide. A giant cabbage leaf had literally fallen from the sky. Gao Yi was startled at first, but she quickly managed to steady her emotions. After all, this wasn't the first time the god of the heavens had provided them with food. She was no longer like that first time, when the sight of a divine being had left her utterly terrified. Overcome with joy, the first thing she did was drop to her knees. She bowed her head toward the sky, loudly thanking the heavenly god for his grace, before finally standing up. She shouted at the top of her lungs, "Everyone come quickly, the heavenly god has given us food again." The villagers, who had been ready to head out with their baskets, suddenly swarmed together at the news. The massive cabbage leaf left them stunned for a moment, but having already been blessed by the giant egg and the white rice, they quickly gathered at Gao Ye's house. Soon, the village chief issued an order, and everyone began the task of dividing the enormous leaf of Chinese cabbage. One piece for every family, and they made sure to set some aside for Chugu and the children who had gone to the county. Set those to one side, the village chief commanded in a loud, firm voice. The villagers lined up obediently, waiting for their turn as the distribution began. Each person cut a generous portion of the cabbage leaf to carry back to their own home. It was exactly as Li Daoxian had predicted. By providing food early in the morning, everything changed. The villagers were no longer in a desperate rush to go out and dig up wild vegetables just to survive. You see, when people are starving, they have only one single driving concern. That concern is eating, but once the problems of food and clothing are solved, 1,000 other interests begin to surface. Almost immediately, we see the villagers beginning to display a more diverse and colorful way of life. Stop digging for a moment. Your pants have been torn for days now. Come here, and your mother will sew them for you. Li Daoxian discovered a middle-aged woman in the village who was quite skilled at sewing. Despite having no advanced tools, someone had brought over a lump of yellow clay. "Show me how to turn this into a pot," one of them requested. Watching the scene at Gao Ye's house, Li Daoxian noticed two middle-aged men busy working with the clay. As it turned out, one of them actually knew the ancient art of making ceramic vessels. It was an impressive skill. In no time at all, he transformed a simple lump of clay into a very handsome pot. The other man tried his best to imitate him, though his movements were a bit more awkward. He even managed to knead together a rather crooked little jar, as our view shifts to another part of the village. As it turns out, the village chief has quite a bit of talent himself. He carved a series of bamboo strips and, in no time at all, wove together a sturdy bamboo basket. "Make that 2 baskets." Li Daoxuan's gaze followed the activity and soon found a blacksmith named Gao Yi. He was busy helping his neighbor forge a new machete. Clink, clink, clink. The rhythmic sound of metal on metal continued for a while. And just like that, the machete was finished. It looked brand new. By now, there were so many more things to see in the observation box that he was watching with genuine delight. But wait, it seems we have stumbled upon a rather unexpected development. Li Daoxian suddenly noticed that Gao Yi was busy drawing water. He pulled a bucket from the well, carried it back to his house, poured it into a large wooden basin, and then firmly shut the door. He even closed the window. It was then that he realized Gao Yi wasn't the one using the water. Wasn't this exactly what those bored netizens on the forums were always talking about? It was about to happen. The young woman was using that bucket of water to wash herself. For some reason, Li Daoxuan's heart began to beat a little faster. He looked at the microscope in his hand, and then back at Gao Yi's dilapidated house. The house was full of holes, especially in the roof. Likely due to the 3-year drought, no one really cared if the roof leaked or not, since it never rained anyway. There was one particular hole through which the interior was clearly visible. If he aimed the microscope toward the roof, which was practically in ruins, he could see everything inside through those gaps. Li Daoxian began to hesitate, telling himself he really ought to be a better person than this. Just as he was struggling with this internal conflict, we see a face suddenly appear in that very hole. It turned out to be Gao Yi, who had stacked tables and stools quite high to reach the opening in the roof. He looked up at the sky through the gap, while Li Daoxian looked down at the hole from above. And so, the eyes of the two met once again. A strange atmosphere hung between them as they held each other's gaze for several long seconds. Gao Yi was the first to look away, not daring to meet the eyes of the celestial god alone. His dirty little face began to sting and turned bright red almost immediately. He blushed so deeply that even the grime on his face couldn't hide it, though he was, of course, incredibly small. The young man stood less than a single centimeter tall, after all. Without his magnifying glass, Li Daoxian couldn't even make out the boy's expression. Much less could he see the faint blush creeping across his cheeks. Suddenly, Gao Yi threw open the door and went running out of the house. He rushed to the village chief's side and lowered his voice, certain the celestial god couldn't possibly hear him. He whispered, "Grandfather Chief, I have something I need to ask you." The chief looked at him, wondering what was wrong, as Gao Yi's face was now as red as pig's liver. The boy stammered that the celestial god seemed to be watching him from the sky at all times. The village chief simply smiled, telling him that this was surely a great blessing. He explained that the god favored him, using his hands to give them food and his mouth to deliver divine decrees. He told Gao Yi he should be grateful, rather than wearing such a strange and worried expression. But the boy could only wonder how he was supposed to change his clothes with a god watching his every move. How am I supposed to change? How am I supposed to shower? He wondered frantically, while the village chief simply sighed at such a silly concern. The old man reminded him that he wasn't even considering who it was that had actually saved his life. What did changing clothes or showering matter? He argued, if the day ever came when the celestial god required his service. In that case, the chief insisted, he should simply obey with absolute devotion. We should note that, at this time, there were many strange beliefs circulating among the common people. There were even certain sects that required women to serve the gods in very specific, personal ways. It was a common enough idea, though of course, those who haven't experienced the mysterious understand nothing of it. And so, we see them trying to protect themselves, even as some sects demanded such total service from their followers. The boy kept spiraling about his privacy, unaware that those who haven't tasted divine grace couldn't possibly understand his position. These women who served with their very bodies were often seen as monks acting as the mouthpiece for the gods. Most were just charlatans, to be honest, and we really shouldn't be too quick to mock the people of ancient times. After all, this sort of thing still happens quite frequently even in our modern world. As Gao Yi listened to the village chief's words, his heart skipped a beat. He realized that since the celestial god had saved his life and fed him, he owed him everything. Did he truly need to serve him that way? In his mind, the young and handsome face of the god flashed vividly. He immediately shook the thought away, scolding himself for even letting his mind wander in such a direction. Utterly exhausted, he finally returned home and looked up at the gaping hole in his roof. He abandoned the idea of covering it. If the celestial god wanted to watch, he decided, then let him watch. His life belonged to the god now, and Gao Yi was prepared to accept that reality. What else could he possibly hide? And so, with a trembling hand, he slowly began to remove his clothes. His dirty body was finally revealed. He hadn't bathed in a very long time, and the yellow sand of the region had caked itself onto his skin. Furthermore, due to chronic malnutrition, he was little more than skin and bones. His body wasn't attractive in the slightest, a fact he mocked bitterly in his own heart. A dirty, skeletal frame standing before a celestial god. He told himself the god wouldn't even deign to look at him, so what was the point in hiding? He took a scrap of torn cloth, wrung it out in a bucket of water, and began to clean himself carefully. He had no idea, of course, that at this very moment Li Daoxian had already put the magnifying glass away. If the girl hadn't caught him earlier, he might have turned into a voyeuristic thief. But he had been caught, and no one with any sense of decency would have the nerve to look a second time. He turned his gaze toward the sky, which looked nothing like the edge of a crafted scene. In his heart, he wondered how those little men were doing, the ones who had gone to the county seat to find the advisor. Once they left the boundaries of the scene, we see that he could no longer track their progress. He couldn't protect them either, and he worried about what might happen if they died out there. The year was 1627 AD. It was the 7th year of Tianqi, in Chunxin County, Shaanxi. Gao Chugu led 3 young men from the Gao family as they passed through the gates of the county seat. The 4 of them were simple country folk who had never once stepped foot outside their village. The journey from Gao village was over 15 kilometers, and they relied entirely on asking for directions along the way. They questioned people on the road, took several wrong turns, and simply kept asking until they found their way. By the time they finally passed through the gates of the county seat, the sun had already reached its highest point in the sky. It was noon, the hottest hour of the day, with the temperature outside climbing to a sweltering 40 degrees. The 4 young men were panting and exhausted, looking very much like overheated dogs in the midday sun. With their heads hanging low and their spirits dampened, they felt as though their weary bodies might simply float away. One of them asked if they truly had to go to the county office to find the advisor, his voice trembling with uncertainty. He confessed his deep fear of the office, having heard rumors that the magistrate was a man who devoured people whole. The others whispered that the servants were just as bad, supposedly eating people without leaving so much as a bone behind. It was a terrifying thought, and we see that the 3 young men were genuinely frightened by these grim tales. Gao Chugu looked at them. He was, after all, just a simple countryman who had never traveled more than 5 kilometers from home. Entering the county seat for the first time, they found themselves intimidated by the sight of the grand mansions and sprawling courtyards. He felt himself trembling slightly, so he reached out to touch his bag of dry rations, squeezing the broken rice tucked inside. This was the emergency supply the village chief had given them before they departed, intended for any desperate need. Each man carried exactly 5 pieces of broken rice in his bag, a meager treasure, but a treasure nonetheless. Feeling the rice calmed his nerves, and he wondered to himself why on earth they were so afraid. He reminded the 3 young men that they had the celestial god himself supporting them. At the mere mention of the celestial god, their spirits lifted and their courage began to return, if only a little. The 4 of them put on their most polite faces and began asking passers-by for directions to their destination. Following the guidance of the locals, they finally arrived at the imposing gates of the county office. But just as they reached the entrance, they witnessed a scene that felt strangely out of place. There stood a middle-aged man with a pale, clean-shaven face and a slightly plump figure. dressed in a long robe. He was wailing and crying loudly right in front of the county office. "Your Honor, the magistrate, I beg of you, please do not dismiss this humble servant." He pleaded that he had always given his absolute best for the magistrate, even to the point of death. He cried out, asking how the magistrate could simply say he was no longer wanted and cast him aside. He lamented that this was a case of killing the hound once the hare is caught, a bit dramatic, perhaps. His tone grew more intense, and his expression became wildly exaggerated, giving him a rather foolish look. The official guarding the gate shook his head and told him, "Sir 3, you really should stop crying here." He explained that His Honor the magistrate had made his decision, and that was simply the end of it. He warned that shouting would achieve nothing, and he might even anger the magistrate enough to be jailed. That would be a far more miserable fate, but as those words were spoken, Gao Sinwu's eyes lit up. He whispered that they only needed to invite the man back, telling the others to keep an eye on him. "When he enters that alleyway," he planned, "we will go and extend our invitation." And then, quite suddenly, he pulled a large wooden club from behind his back. He had picked it up along the road while they were traveling toward the county seat. The man continued to cry and scream in front of the office, but we see it was all in vain. Magistrate Zhang Yaokai had already reached his limit and was completely fed up with him. No matter how much the man wailed, the magistrate remained unmoved and even sent 2 bailiffs to beat him. They beat him until he was bruised, and only then did the poor fellow realize the magistrate's mind was set. Zhang Tan, feeling the weight of a lifetime, finally left the office and walked a short distance down the main street. Upon reaching a corner, he ducked into a small alleyway, hoping to take a shortcut home. As he headed home through the alleyway, quite unexpectedly, he had only taken a few steps when he saw a young man standing right in front of him. Seeing the massive wooden club in the stranger's hand, Zhang Tan was terrified and quickly spun around to flee. He imagined running back the way he came, but we see that 3 other young men were already blocking his path from behind. Trapped and with sweat pouring down his forehead, Zhang Tan was now truly frightened for his life. His eyes darted between the 4 youths, and judging them to be nothing more than poor ruffians, he quickly raised his hands in surrender. He spoke rapidly, pleading with them not to hit him and claiming that he was actually on their side. He insisted that the one desperately collecting taxes was the county magistrate and that he himself had nothing to do with it. He even claimed he had been trying to persuade the official not to impose such heavy taxes on the people. He called the situation an abyss for the common folk, which caused Gao Chugu to burst out into loud laughter. It turned out there was more to the story, and Zhang Tan quickly doubled down, insisting his words were the absolute truth. He argued that it was precisely because he spoke up for them that the magistrate had kicked him out and terminated his employment. To hear him tell it, this was a noble case of standing up against corrupt authority. Gao Chugu scratched his head, admitting that while he didn't quite understand everything being said, he could tell the man was very learned, a compliment that Zhang Tan eagerly accepted. He identified himself as a man of letters, telling them they couldn't possibly be so rude to a scholar like him. He urged them to quickly lower the clubs they were holding in their hands. He suggested they all sit down and speak to one another calmly, as civilized men should. He used a fancy idiom about releasing pigeons and dissolving horses, which, to be honest, was a bit much for this alleyway. Gao Chugu simply smiled, showing his teeth in a way that wasn't entirely reassuring. He remarked that it was good to be learned, because a man of letters was exactly who they were looking to invite. "Please, come with us to Gao Village," he said, though it sounded more like a command than an invitation. Zhang Tin stammered in response, asking what kind of place this Gao Village even was. He insisted that he wouldn't go and didn't want to go, calling the very idea an outrage. But his protests were cut short when a heavy wooden club struck the back of his head with a dull thud. Zhang Tin didn't even have time to groan before he collapsed to the ground, leaving the young villager standing over him. Putting the club away, the youth admitted that he didn't know why, but he just felt an urge to hit the man whenever he spoke. He found the scholar's fancy words incredibly annoying, mostly because he couldn't understand a single thing he was saying. Gao Chugu grinned, showing his teeth, and confessed that he had actually felt the exact same urge. The 4 of them shared a quiet laugh before 2 of them reached down to hoist the unconscious Zhang Tin up. To any observer, he looked like a wealthy stranger, his head hanging low as he remained completely passed out. Unfortunately for them, the local tax collectors noticed the commotion and turned their attention toward the group immediately. Imagine the scene. It looked for all the world like a group of poor peasants was robbing and kidnapping a wealthy gentleman. One of the tax collectors shouted out, demanding to know what the 4 of them were up to. He asked what they were doing, catching Gao Chugu and the others right in the middle of their amateur kidnapping attempt. The moment they saw the officials, the 4 young men lost their nerve and cowered instinctively. They struggled to find a way to escape, but as fate would have it, the tax collector looked closer and recognized Gao Chugu. He realized the boy was from Gao Village, and Gao Chugu, looking closely himself, recognized the official in return. This was the same collector who had been so terrified the day before that he ran away with his tail between his legs. He had been so anxious about divine retribution that his soul hadn't quite returned to his body, leaving him a nervous wreck. In fact, he was currently so frightened that he didn't dare to leave the safety of the city walls at all. He had dragged a few colleagues along just to bolster his courage, and only then did he dare to step out onto the street. Right behind him stood the 4 tax collectors who had been blown away by a single gust of wind the day before. They were equally terrified, of course, and now the 5 of them were walking together simply to keep each other's spirits up. Unexpectedly, we see them spot the people from Gao village right there on the streets of the county town. Deep down, they wondered if perhaps the celestial god himself had sent these villagers to find them. They feared the villagers were there to keep watch and see if they had dared to reveal what had happened. The 5 tax collectors were so utterly frightened that their faces actually began to turn a sickly shade of green. Gao Chubu was also quite startled by the encounter and began to stammer out an explanation. He claimed their friend had simply fainted from the sun and they were taking him to the river to wash his face. The 5 tax collectors stammered back, telling them to please, by all means, carry on with their business. They quickly added that regarding the events of yesterday, they hadn't breathed a single word to anyone. And so, both groups stood there for a moment, trembling slightly at the exact same time. They passed each other in the street, and the very moment they were clear, the 5 collectors broke into a full sprint. Not to be outdone, Gao Chubu and his group also took off running in the opposite direction. With their backs to one another, both parties fled at top speed, which was a rather absurd sight to behold. Meanwhile, Li Dashuan watched the entire scene unfold, staring in a state of complete and utter bewilderment. Another full day passed, and whenever he felt a bit hungry, he simply ordered some food to be delivered. And just like that, without us even noticing the time slip away, evening finally arrived. The setting sun outside the window began to drape everything in a warm, golden twilight glow. Even the landscape within the constructed scene shifted, taking on the soft, fading light of the sunset. Naturally, there are fluorescent lamps throughout the house. The light from these lamps illuminates the constructed scene and should, in theory, pass through the glass into the box. But, in reality, we see that the external light doesn't penetrate the scene inside at all. The sky within the box is simply growing darker and darker as time goes on. To be honest, this box contains far too many strange mysteries for comfort. Lida Akshuan, however, has stopped complaining about small details like the lighting. Now, he is becoming a bit worried about Gao Chubu and the other 3 young villagers who left for the county town. They had set out early in the morning, and yet, they still haven't returned. He wonders if something happened to them out there, a feeling much like owning a few small kittens. Imagine 4 mischievous kittens have escaped from the house, and you have no idea where they've gone. As their master, he is quite concerned about whether they will be able to return home safely. But just at that moment, 5 tiny figures suddenly appear at the very edge of his field of vision. Lida Akshuan cheers up instantly. It seems they have made it back in one piece after all. And so they have. Gao Chubu and his group have finally returned to the village. Siyu Sanseer, whom they had knocked unconscious earlier, had already woken up halfway through the journey. Since then, the 4 fierce villagers had been forcing him to walk at the point of their large wooden clubs. Sanseer didn't dare to resist, secretly watching the 4 of them and concluding they were quite simple-minded folk. He realized there was no reasoning with them. If he spoke too much nonsense, they would likely just hit him with a stick. He had no choice but to shut his mouth and follow them obediently all the way back to Gao village. A journey of over 30 li is certainly no easy task for someone like Siyu Sanseer, whose limbs were still numb. Besides not having eaten a single thing all day, he was utterly disheartened by the time he finally reached Gao village. He could barely catch his breath, and as soon as they stepped inside the village, Sanseer simply collapsed onto the ground. He gasped that they had finally arrived, asking these brave gentlemen what exactly they intended for him to do there. Gao Chubu ignored the complaints, telling the others they could speak now and that this place was called the Tukyang Vijian. He ordered the other 3 to keep a close eye on Siyu Sanseer while he went to call for Ye. And with that, he went running off toward Gao Ye's house. He intended to use his own voice to notify the celestial god, but Lida Akshuan had already seen everything unfolding. To be honest, this group of people hardly needs to send a formal notification to someone who sees all. Arriving in front of the house, he began calling out urgently for Ye. As for Gao Ye, he had just finished his dinner and was inside mending some old clothes when he heard the voice of the celestial god. His entire body trembled, and he leaped up so suddenly from his broken stool that it fell over with a loud thud. He knelt immediately on the floor, asking what orders the celestial god, Lida Akshuan, had for him. Lida Akshuan explained that Gao Chubu had brought someone back who seemed to possess a bit of knowledge. He told the old man to come and help him ask the stranger a few questions, and Gao Ye understood perfectly. He confirmed that he would obey the orders of the celestial god without question. Lida Akshuan told him to move quickly, as Gao Chubu was just about to arrive at his front door. Gao Ye stood up and hurried to open the door, and just at that very moment, Gao Chubu, who was just about to knock, found his hand frozen in midair as the door creaked open toward the inside. Startled, Gao Chubu stood there motionless, managed a confused look, and simply muttered, "Yeah." When he asked how the old man knew he was there, Gao Ye simply replied that the great god told him he had returned. He adds that he has also brought a scholar back with him, and Gao Chubu looks toward the sky with a deeply reverent gaze. At that very moment, Gao Ye begins running toward the village entrance as fast as his old legs can carry him. Word travels fast, and soon many people in the village have heard the news. After all, it is a very small place where neighbors watch through their windows. From their homes, they can see exactly what is unfolding at the entrance of the village. In an instant, everyone comes outside. All 42 inhabitants, men, women, young, and old alike, gather in front of Sancerre. By this time, the sun has nearly finished its descent for the day. The slanted, golden rays of the sunset cast long shadows across the entire village. With their shadows stretching out beside them, the villagers stand in the fading light, watching Sancerre in total silence. It is a rather strange and unsettling sight, and Sancerre suddenly feels the weight of it. He feels an immense, overwhelming pressure radiating from the crowd. It is all quite bizarre, really, and in his panic, he begins to babble that he has no intention of causing trouble. He desperately tries to explain that he isn't there to force them to pay any taxes. He swears to the heavens that he is actually there to speak on their behalf. He claims he even advised the elder, Lord Xianzuan, not to collect taxes from them at all. He insists he was kicked out of the government office for that very reason, and he truly swears it is the truth. He begs them to believe him and, more importantly, implores them not to hit him. If they have any complaints, he suggests they take them up with Lord Xianzuan instead. It is a classic attempt to shift the blame, we might say, as the villagers silently part to both sides. Gao Ye steps forward to the front of the group, facing Sancerre directly. The old man takes center stage, and Sancerre's gaze naturally falls upon him. Deep down, he is muttering to himself, wondering what on earth is wrong with this village. In any normal village, it is always a venerable old man who steps forward to speak for the people. So why does this village have a young woman instead? Meanwhile, Gao Ye tilts his ear as if listening to something. He listens to a voice from the heavens, and then, with a dead serious expression, asks, "Who are you?" He continues his interrogation, asking what office he holds, how many books he has read, and what his background is. Sancerre gathers his courage and gives his name again, explaining he was born on October 2nd. Because of that date, they called him Sancerre, and he hails from the Qinshan County Magistrate in Shanxi Province. His career was going well enough, he claims, but he has already been dismissed from his post. He boasts of studying hard for 10 years and traveling the whole country, the very definition of a man of talent. Li Daoxian listens to the first part of the man's story, but he has a much more pressing question. He asks what year and month it is. Gao Ye quickly relays the words of the heavenly god to the stranger. Upon hearing such a question, Sancerre looks around at the villagers in complete and utter confusion. He wonders what this man is talking about, asking what the date is. What exactly is the situation with these people? He had heard that peasants in rural areas often don't leave their villages for years at a time. They are blind to the outside world, which is true enough, but for them to ask something like this? He wonders what it could possibly mean, but despite his confusion, he doesn't dare leave the question unanswered. Sancerre turns serious and informs them that it is currently the 7th month of the 7th year of Tianqi. And then, suffering from a sudden lack of vocabulary, he finds himself unable to summarize the era with a proper idiom. He clutches his head with both hands, looking as though the inability to find the right words is causing him physical pain. To him, it was simply unacceptable, though the villagers find his ridiculous display rather amusing. The man's antics made the villagers laugh and cry, but Li Daoxian didn't laugh. Instead, he froze in place. You see, having spent years on history and military forums, he knew the 7th year of Tianqi all too well. This was a reign name that actually existed during the Ming Dynasty, a very specific piece of the past. In this year, Emperor Tianqi died of illness, and Emperor Chongzhen ascended to the throne to face a crumbling world. A great drought gripped the country. The Ningmu peasant rebellion was about to ignite, and the Ming Dynasty was beginning its end. The final 10 years of struggle were looming, and he couldn't help but wonder what on earth was happening. Was the landscape he was looking at through the screen truly a real, historical dynasty? No, he told himself. Perhaps it was all just a strange coincidence. It could simply be a coincidence in the name of the era, nothing more. Or so he hoped. With a heavy voice, Li Daoxian commanded Gao Ye to ask the stranger the name of the current emperor. Gao Ye asked immediately, and Sancerre's expression turned grave the moment he was questioned about the sovereign's name. He stammered that the emperor's sacred name was something a lowly person like him wouldn't dare to utter. In his mind, this silence was a way of obeying his lord and benefiting the people, a noble gesture, really. Li Daoxian, however, wasn't having it and told Gao Ye that this fellow was refusing to give the name. He declared the heavenly god was furious and ordered everyone to grab their weapons and give the man a sound thrashing. Gao Ye was the first to snatch up a large wooden club, and the other young villagers quickly followed suit. They gripped their sticks tightly as the rest of the villagers began searching for anything they could use as a weapon. Under the glow of the setting sun, we see a large crowd of villagers beginning to swarm together. They raised a messy assortment of items: clay pots, bamboo spikes, table legs, and even heavy carrying poles. When Sancerre saw this formation, his face turned pale. Without waiting for the villagers to strike, he immediately started screaming. Zhu Yuxiao, Zhu Yuxiao. The current emperor's name is Zhu Yuxiao, he shrieked. At that particular moment, he couldn't have cared less about the consequences of speaking the sovereign's name. After all, the so-called emperor was far away in the mountains, a distant figure in a distant palace. Imperial power rarely reaches down into the villages, and right now, saving his own skin was his only priority. He didn't care about taboos anymore. He even forgot that an emperor is supposed to be treated with absolute reverence. The emperor's name was indeed Zhu Yuxiao, and as the truth settled in, Li Daoxuan's expression darkened significantly. We see Li Daoxian signaling Gao Ye to press the man further about the state of the world. Gao Ye asked immediately, but Sancerre was so terrified by the makeshift weapons that he didn't even understand the question. The world situation was beyond him, so he simply began reciting an official document he had seen at the county office. He blurted out that on May 11th, the Jianzhou army besieged Jianzhou, and the imperial court mobilized troops in response. By May 28th, the enemy had divided their forces at Gongmingyuan, where Duke Yuan Chonghuan and officer Lu Jinquan waited. The vice minister, Dong Bai, had quickly ordered the soldiers to mount the walls and prepare the defense. They camped within the moat and began a heavy bombardment with their cannons, a desperate struggle, to be sure. As he reached this part of his recitation, he noticed the villagers around him looking utterly confused. They clearly didn't understand a word, which made him uneasy, especially since their weapons hadn't been lowered yet. Sensing he might be losing his audience, Sancerre realized he needed to continue his report to stay alive. He spoke of how Man Gui led the guerrilla forces and Zhu Dasho brought troops to engage in a massive battle outside the city. There were heavy casualties on both sides. Man Gui was struck by several arrows as the Jianzhou army pressed their attack. They struck Jinzhou with everything they had, but the city held firm, and eventually, the invaders were forced to retreat. He stopped there, breathless, unable to remember any more of the official report, which, naturally, was a bit of a problem. Sweat poured down his face in torrents, as he was certain his time had finally come. He couldn't remember anything else, and he terrified himself wondering if they would kill him for it. To be perfectly honest, one could say he had reached a truly critical moment in his life. He had recited quite enough by now, and Li Daoxian had heard all he needed to hear. It was now confirmed that Zhaojin village was no mythical land of tiny people. Instead, we find ourselves in the Great Ming Dynasty, specifically during its final, most difficult years. It's no wonder Gao village is so desolate, and the people are starving. Such was life for the common folk back then. He had read about these hardships in history books before, but reading isn't the same as seeing. It wasn't intuitive until now. Only by seeing Zhaojin village could he truly feel the weight of it. This time, Li Daoxian understood everything perfectly. He decided not to embarrass the man further, having learned everything he wanted to know. Seeing the captive looking so exhausted and hungry, he simply told the others to give him something to eat. He no longer had the patience to deal with the village's minor affairs, moving now with great speed. He opened his computer, launched the browser, and went straight to his search engine. He searched for information on the late Ming Dynasty, diving headfirst into the vast ocean of history. Back in the village, as soon as Gao Jie's order was given, the villagers immediately lowered their weapons. They gave a quick nod to the heavens before scattering and returning to their respective homes. Sancerre breathed a sigh of relief, though he secretly suspected this was some sort of evil cult. Falling into the hands of a cult is a bad omen, he thought, so he decided he had to play along. He told himself that to survive and return home, he would have to fake his loyalty for now. Imitating the villagers, he bowed his head toward the heavens, though he had no idea which god he was actually bowing to. Regardless, he figured bowing was the right move. To save his own life, there was no room for shame. Gao Jie then spoke up, telling him to follow her, so she could get him something to eat. Sancerre was more than helpful, hurrying to keep pace with her as they walked along. He asked in a low voice, noting that the entire village seemed to be worshipping a specific deity. He wondered aloud which god they prayed to, thinking this was quite a strange way to send reinforcements. Gao Jie didn't actually know. It was the first time Sancerre had ever heard of someone not knowing who they were praying to. To him, these villagers seemed far too simple, believing in a god that was likely just a fabrication. Gao Jie simply insisted that the great god was, well, the great god. He hadn't revealed his name, and they didn't dare ask, knowing only that his magical power was limitless. She described him as kind and benevolent, a protector who looked after everyone in Gao village. They all survived because of him, a claim that made Sancerre scoff inwardly. In his mind, only gullible peasants would believe in myths invented by charlatans. He told himself that as a man who had read the books of the sages, he wouldn't be fooled so easily. He was lost in these cynical thoughts right up until the moment they arrived at Gao Jie's house. Sancerre pushed open the worn wooden door, which gave a sharp creak as it swung wide. She told him to sit for a moment while she went to the kitchen to prepare a meal. But as Sancerre looked up to scan the interior of Gao Jie's home, he was suddenly struck dumb with disbelief. There, in the corner of the room, he saw a massive pile of white rice. It was truly enormous. Each individual grain was the size of an inkwell. We also see a single leaf of white cabbage leaning against the wall. It isn't even a whole leaf. One can tell just by looking at the veins. A mere fragment cut from the cabbage leaf is as large as an entire wall. Gao Jie gathered a few grains of rice and tore off a piece of that massive cabbage leaf. She placed them into a bamboo basket and made her way into the kitchen. It seems she intends to use these ingredients to prepare a meal for him. Sancier's mouth hung open in utter astonishment, and it took quite a while for him to close it. What kind of rice was this? And what on earth was this vegetable? What kind of village was this? And who was this first god? Sancier is a typical intellectual of the old world. He certainly knows more than the illiterate. He isn't easily fooled by charlatans, yet he cannot completely rid himself of superstition. While he doesn't believe the nonsense of the White Lotus sect, he isn't exactly an atheist either. He still believes gods exist, and after standing frozen for nearly a minute, he rushed to the kitchen to ask Gao Jie about this immortal. Had the deity truly given them this food? Gao Jie simply replied that she didn't know. Sancier was incredulous. You didn't even think to ask? He wondered aloud. To him, it seemed impossible to consider oneself a messenger of the gods under such circumstances. He felt she was doing the villagers a disservice, as they didn't even know whom they were revering. If they ever had to build a temple in the future, they wouldn't even know which deity to worship. It was a state of total confusion, though he admitted Gao Jie did have a point. Still, men of great learning tend to consider these matters much more carefully. Xianyang lifts her head and cries out toward the sky, calling for the great celestial god. She asks how they should address his honorable title, hoping for some kind of sign. But the sky remains calm and silent. No one answers her plea. At this very moment, Li Daoxian has already stepped away to read his history books. He is deeply immersed in the history of the expulsion of invaders during the late Ming dynasty. He cannot hear the voice of the young woman from the box reaching his ears. Gao Jie tells her that perhaps the great celestial god simply doesn't wish to say. Suddenly, dawn breaks, and we see Li Daoxian with eyes quite bloodshot from lack of sleep. He glances at the morning light beginning to shine through his window. Without even realizing it, he has spent the entire night studying historical records. He has finished a rough reading of the history regarding the invaders at the end of the Ming era. By now, he has a general understanding of how the entire process unfolded. However, there are still many specific details that remain frustratingly unclear. The history books used many subtle literary techniques, leading to several contradictions in the text. It simply won't do. He double-clicks his mouse to open a file on his desktop. It is a compilation of the key problems he summarized throughout the night. Problem 1. Items dropped into the landscape box increase 200 times in length, width, and height. The weight increases as well, though being an art student, he can't calculate the exact physics. Regardless, a simple 50-gram egg would transform into hundreds of tons. Using this logic, he realizes it doesn't cost much at all to sustain a tiny person. Supporting 42 tiny people is, quite frankly, no problem at all for him. He could easily provide them with a comfortable life, complete with fine food and drink. But things change if he intends to support millions, or even tens of millions, of these little people. If he tries to protect them all, he faces the rather embarrassing prospect of going bankrupt in his own world. And so, we come to the big question. What exactly is his ultimate goal here? Is he content with just saving these 42 little souls? Or does he want to do everything in his power to save as many Ming Dynasty citizens as possible? If he chooses to save the entire country, he realizes his financial resources are woefully insufficient and requires a rethink. Then there is problem 2, the brutal wars at the end of the Ming dynasty. The little people could find themselves in mortal danger at any given moment. Meanwhile, he still needs to live his own life, to eat, to sleep, and to bathe. Occasionally, he might even want to go out on a date with a girl. He simply cannot keep a watchful eye on Zhao Xingxian 24 hours a day. He worries that he might step out to buy groceries and return home only to find his 42 little friends gone. They could be slaughtered by the imperial court, the invaders, or the rebel forces while he is away. A figure like Zhang Xianzong could wipe out Zhao Xingxian, leaving behind nothing but ruins and corpses. Since this possibility is quite high, he concludes that the little people's ability to protect themselves must be improved. Finally, we have question 3 regarding the scale of the box, which is 2.5 meters long. This world of Zhao Xingxian, spanning 1.5 meters by 300 meters in scale, is quite limited. It barely covers Gao Village and its surrounding fields, leaving him no way to directly influence places he cannot see. Is there a way to expand this world? This is the most urgent question that occurred to him all night, and it desperately needs an answer. Of course, question 3 is a bit of a mystical problem, so he can only let nature take its course for now. For the time being, we see him focusing his efforts on solving the first 2 problems. He turns his attention to the challenges ahead. As someone who considers himself kind-hearted, he naturally has no intention of saving only these 42 little people. If possible, he wants to save as many as he can, the poor, the elderly, or perhaps even the entire country. Therefore, he realizes he cannot simply rely on himself to drop food into their world forever. To be honest, doing that isn't scientific at all. It would only create idle, lethargic people who wait for handouts. He knows he must mobilize the little people in the box to grow their own food and face life with their own strength. With that thought in mind, he decides it is time to take action. The first thing he must do is provide these tiny people with a reliable source of water. Only with water will they have true vitality. But how exactly does one provide water to such a tiny world? Obviously, simply taking the garden hose and pouring it into the box is out of the question. A stream of water magnified 200 times rushing into the village wouldn't be called a water supply. It would be called a flood, a catastrophic disaster for our little friends. Ladoxuan searches the internet and discovers that even the finest mist sprayed by a humidifier is problematic. That mist is still 0.3 millimeters in diameter in our world. But once it passes through the box and enters the end of the Ming dynasty, it transforms into dense, heavy water droplets 6 centimeters wide. If he sprayed that over the village, it would be a superstorm capable of collapsing their straw houses. Ladoxuan's gaze shifts. He turns back to his box, Loki Lock, and he carefully picks it up. He pointed to an open space next to the village and made a gesture. Yes, that would do nicely. Deciding it could be placed there, he reached his hand toward the ground and dug in with force. In an instant, he had carved out a large hole. By morning, we see the villagers waking up very early. As soon as dawn breaks, these hardworking people begin preparing themselves for the day's labor. But there is a great drought and the land is parched, leaving them with no agricultural work to do. Normally, they would have risen early to forage for wild vegetables, but they still have over 100 grains of white rice at home. And with several large cabbage leaves also in reserve, there is no urgent need to rush out for wild greens. So, after getting up, everyone begins tending to various chores, weaving bamboo baskets or sharpening knives. They catch up on tasks that had been neglected, doing things they simply couldn't find time for before. Then there is the family of our friend Branchies. They are quite excited, as everything has changed in this universal sort of way. It was simply the impossible. For the people of Say Dokmi, it was beyond anything they had ever known. The local official had intended to return to the city after seeing the state of the village. But last night, he saw a rice the size of grinding stones and giant cabbage leaves that defied logic. Although he couldn't understand it, he was deeply shocked and felt a sudden urge to stay in this village a little longer. After leaving Gao Ye's house, he slept under the eaves, a difficult night for a pampered secretary. He is not someone who usually wakes up this early, and after being roused by Gao Ye, he remains in a daze. He turned over and sat up, wondering aloud if the sun had already risen. Gao Ye reminded him that after giving him a full meal last night, he had told him to return to the county. The official muttered to himself, wondering why on earth he hadn't left the night before. It was quite inexplicable, really, but before he could say another word, Gao Ye's expression suddenly changed. As it turns out, he saw a giant hand descending from the sky. It began digging in an open space next to the village. The ground trembled, and a massive pit appeared. Following Gao Ye's gaze, he couldn't see Hideo Xian's hand, but he saw the ground suddenly change. A huge hole opened up as the earth was excavated by an invisible force, turning the soil into sand. The debris was placed to one side. To be honest, the whole thing was truly inconceivable. It was earth-shattering, and poor 32 found himself completely stunned by the sight. He wondered if he was dreaming and if he should perhaps just go back to sleep. In his shock, he even forgot his favorite 4-character summary, which is saying something for him. Naturally, all the villagers were alarmed by the commotion and rushed out to see. As they all ran toward the open space, Gao Ye quickly jumped up and shouted to them. He warned his neighbors not to get too close, so as not to interfere with the great god's magic. The villagers stopped, puzzled, while Gao Ye watched intently, seeing the giant hand of the great god at work. It dug into the ground several times, creating a rectangular pit over 10 zan long and 8 zan deep. Then, we see the giant hand pulling out a large, transparent box. It descended slowly from the sky, landing perfectly within the pit that had just been excavated. While 32 and the villagers couldn't see the hand itself, they could see the massive transparent box being sealed in. They watched it float down from the heavens, falling precisely into the center of the earth. Everyone stood there absolutely stunned, having no idea what had just happened before their eyes. Lytic Swan clapped his hands in satisfaction. The storage pond was finally built. He picked up a glass full of water and began slowly pouring it into the Loki lock box. And so, the tiny people inside the box witnessed a truly bizarre scene. They saw a waterfall suddenly manifest out of thin air in the middle of the sky. A massive torrent of water cascaded from the heavens, rushing directly into the great box on the ground. In no time at all, the box was completely filled with water. The villagers stood there, utterly speechless, until finally, 32 whispered that a silver galaxy was falling for 9 days. Gao Ye, it seems you finally exceeded your 4-character limit this time, a real shock to the system. To be honest, words weren't enough to describe the magnificence appearing right next to Gaojia village. A giant pond had appeared, vast and wide, as if it had always belonged there. It was an unfathomable, massive reservoir, filled with what we would recognize as fresh, modern water. It was so clear and bright. These villagers, suffering through drought, hadn't seen water like this in years. Water. It was real water. Good God, they had never seen such a massive pool of it. It was incredibly clean. They wondered, deep down, if this was truly a gift meant for them. They could hardly believe their luck, shouting praises and long life to the celestial god. Meanwhile, Li Daoxian looked down from above and focused his gaze on Gao Ye. He told Ye to inform the villagers that, from now on, he would replenish this pond every single day. Everyone would be allowed to draw water from the pond for their daily needs in the future. Today, they could finally irrigate the fields. Gao Ye was delighted and immediately bowed in gratitude. He then turned to his neighbors and loudly announced Li Daoxuan's divine decree to the crowd. The villagers erupted in cheers immediately, realizing they no longer had to fear the drought. They finally had water to grow their crops. It was, quite simply, a miracle. The seeds they had treasured so carefully could finally, at long last, be put to good use. "What are we waiting for?" they shouted. "Hurry home and grab a bucket to draw some water." But we see some were more cautious, reminding the others to relax, as the weather was still far too hot. They wondered what crops could even survive this heat, thinking perhaps they should wait until autumn. It seems they celebrated a bit too soon. The villagers were so wild with joy they were practically tripping over themselves. However, we noticed the women's eyes lighting up with a very specific realization. With this much water available, they could finally, mercifully, wash their clothes. They could actually bathe. They had spent over half a year feeling dirty and smelling of the road. What woman could endure that forever? Naturally, they rushed to fill their own water tanks first. By this point, Gao Ye's tears were flowing freely, and who could blame her, really? She looked up at the sky, though of course, there was nothing left to see there now. She turned her gaze back to the pond, confirming that it truly and honestly sat right there before her. That scene wasn't a dream. An invisible force had truly created a pond from nothing and hung a waterfall in midair. Out of thin air, an invisible and intangible force had manifested a miracle. It felt like a dream, yet it was real. This unseen power had built a reservoir and draped a waterfall from the void. If anyone dared to suggest this wasn't the work of a god, she would be the first to jump into the pond in protest. Meanwhile, the foreman of the grain collectors was slapping himself in a fit of pure, bewildered fury. Gao Ye, standing nearby, finally spoke up to address the man. "Master Li," she said, "the celestial god has something he wishes to tell you." Master Li snapped out of his trance and quickly offered a deep, sweeping bow toward the heavens. "What orders does the celestial god have?" Li Daoxuan asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. "It seems you are the advisor to the county magistrate, aren't you?" she replied. Gao Ye asked this quickly, assuming that he had always held that prestigious position. As soon as she said this, a look of pure bitterness washed over Master Li's face. This humble servant spoke for the people the other day, advising his lordship not to collect taxes, which only enraged him. He had been thrown out onto the street, and, to be honest, he knew they would never hire him again. This is what one might call playing with fire and getting burned. Li Daoxuan sighed. It seemed a spell of misfortune had already been cast upon him. Master Li bowed low and admitted that, indeed, that was exactly what had happened. "Shut up, it bothers me just to hear you," Li Daoxuan snapped with a sudden bad mood. "Don't you realize how incredibly annoying your way of speaking is? It's no wonder the county magistrate threw you out onto the street," he added coldly. Master Li struggled to maintain his composure, while Li Daoxuan admitted he had thought he was a capable advisor, someone who could read official documents at the county office and bring useful news back to Gao Village. "Now it seems you're completely useless, aren't you?" he concluded, which was a bit harsh, really. Master Li felt a slight pang of emotion upon hearing those blunt words. He wondered what the celestial god could possibly mean by all of this. Could it be that the god had originally planned for him to be hired to work for him? To be able to work for a god is a blessing that spans many lifetimes, after all. He told himself he couldn't let this opportunity pass. Even if he died and rose again, he had to be the god's messenger. He quickly blurted out that he was useful, insisting over and over that this humble servant could be of great service. Even though he no longer worked at the county office, he was clever and quick, skilled in both writing and calculations. He argued that if the celestial god had any complex orders, the villagers could simply instruct him on what to do. It would be far more reliable that way, he claimed, and he was just about to summarize his point with a fancy proverb. Suddenly, he remembered that the celestial god found him annoying, so he forced himself to shut his mouth instantly. The sudden stop was so abrupt that his face twisted into a rather comical expression of suppressed speech. Li Daoxian found the sight quite amusing, wondering if the man truly was as capable as he claimed. For the time being, he told him, he couldn't think of anything specific that required his immediate attention. He instructed him to return to the county seat, keep his eyes wide open, and sharpen his ears for any rumors. He was to find out everything possible about local events and send word to Gao Village if any important news broke. If the need arose for a specific task, the god promised to send a messenger to find him. Master Li prostrated himself on the ground, pressing his forehead firmly against the dirt in a show of absolute devotion. He accepted the orders, and once the old man felt he had shown enough respect, he finally concluded his display. He stood up and began the long walk back toward the county seat. Li Daoxian watched him go, reflecting on the fact that he still hadn't found a way to expand his own vision. The scenic model was currently fixed only on Gao Village, leaving the rest of the world hidden from his sight. With this man acting as his agent, it was like having an extra pair of eyes outside the boundaries of the village. He hoped that these eyes would prove useful when the inevitable moment of crisis finally arrived. We return our gaze to the village, where we see that all the residents are busy with their daily chores. The strong young men are hard at work digging in the fields, where a large pond is beginning to take shape. They finally have the confidence to plant again, and though the next harvest won't be until autumn, their restless hearts are eager to begin. Their drive simply cannot be contained, so we see them digging a water canal well in advance. Li Daoxian nodded in approval. It seemed the villagers' capacity for self-sufficiency had finally been sparked. For the next few months, he knew he would still need to support them, but come autumn, everything would change. They would start farming and sustaining themselves, and the cost of maintaining this village would finally begin to decrease. He wondered if he could use this same method to help other villages, which, to be honest, was a rather ambitious thought. If he succeeded, he could prevent countless people from dying of hunger. Next, he decided it was time to start solving his second major problem. When he wasn't near the scenic model, the villagers needed to have the ability to protect themselves. Recalling the historical military forums and novels he used to read, the first idea that came to his mind was quite bold. He considered equipping all 42 villagers with modern weapons, but he immediately realized that this idea wasn't exactly feasible at the moment. Setting aside whether such a move would land him in prison in the modern world, there was a more practical issue. Even if he could obtain weapons legally, even the smallest firearms in the world presented a scale problem. The Swiss minigun, for example, is only 55 millimeters long. If he placed that into the box, it would become 200 times larger, and the villagers would see a giant 11-meter-long pistol. How on earth is one supposed to use this thing? After all, who could possibly handle a pistol that is 11 meters long? To drive away their enemies, his next idea was to commission some truly microscopic weapons. However, he would need to ensure each weapon was only a few millimeters long. Otherwise, it simply wouldn't work once it was scaled up 200 times. It would end up being 12 meters in size, far too large for people from the Middle Ages to use normally. Obviously, with the craftsmanship available today, no one can actually manufacture a functional firearm only a few millimeters long. If he were to provide ordinary swords, the improvement in our villagers' combat effectiveness would be quite limited. The only real solution for Li Daoxian, it seemed, was to teach the villagers how to manufacture muskets for themselves. But considering the technical skills of those 42 people living inside the scenic box, well, never mind making muskets. It was difficult for them to even forge a high-quality knife. At the moment, they were only capable of heavy labor, such as cutting firewood, or perhaps making simple kitchen knives, so he decided to set that plan aside for the future. For the time being, we see that there was only one practical way to ensure the villagers' safety, and that was a solid castle, the most common means of protection for villagers in ancient times. Hiding inside a sturdy fortress could, after all, resist most raids by bandits and thieves. The most representative building for this would be an Aka house, something Li Daoxian could actually source in the real world. He simply needed to find a model of an Aka house at a 200:1 scale and place it inside the box. Letting the little people move into such a structure would make them far safer than they are now. This was entirely feasible, though it would, of course, cost a bit of money. Li Daoxian realized he would need to head out to find someone capable of manufacturing such a specific 200:1 model. However, he knew the world inside the box was set during the chaotic years following the Ming dynasty. And to be honest, he didn't feel comfortable leaving the box unattended for very long. He was deeply worried that he might return home only to find the tiny bodies of the villagers scattered everywhere. But after a moment of reflection, a light bulb suddenly went off in his head. He moved his home security camera and placed it right next to the scenic box, carefully adjusting the angle. After that, he opened the camera application on his phone. From there, we see that he could clearly monitor the general situation inside the box. Now he could finally leave with some peace of mind, so he quickly hailed a taxi. He headed straight for the home of his friend, Kai Xinzi. 15 minutes later, Li Daoxian was standing in the middle of Kai Xinzi's living room. Kai Xinzi is a businessman who specializes in models, cars, ships, figures, robots, and even dinosaurs. In short, he makes just about any model one could possibly imagine. This is why, when Li Daoxian first received the box, he assumed it was a gift from this old friend. Kai Xinzi grinned at him, noting that it had been quite a long time since Daoxian last visited. He jokingly asked what Daoxian was trying to trick him into this time, which made Li Daoxian smile. He assured him there was no trickery involved this time. He was here as a paying customer. Kai Xinzi told him to stop talking nonsense, reminding him he still hadn't paid for the Liaoning model from last time. Usually, whenever money was mentioned, Li Daoxian wouldn't say a single word. But this time, he simply pulled out his phone and transferred 1,000 yuan on the spot. Kai Xinzi was actually startled by the speed of the transfer. It was almost terrifying. He immediately suspected that whatever Daoxian wanted must be incredibly difficult to make. He jokingly claimed he wouldn't accept the order, which prompted Li Daoxian to laugh and scold him. He teased his friend for being impossible to please even when the payment was instant. He noted with a smile that things were never easy with him, whether he paid up front or not. You aren't lazy at all, Kai Shinzi, Li Daoxian remarked, noting his friend's sharp business intuition. Li Daoxian then held out his hands, gesturing to a length of about half a meter. I want an aka house this big, he explained, at a scale of 200 to 1. He knew that if these items were placed inside the scenic box, they would be magnified 200 times. If the model was half a meter long, putting it in the box would make it 100 meters, exactly the size of a real aka house. Kai Shinzi was quite surprised and naturally asked what on earth he wanted such a thing for. Of course, he couldn't tell the truth, so he opted for a small white lie instead. He claimed that he had recently been watching a lot of animated films. He mentioned Big Fish and Begonia features an aka house, and he simply wanted a model of his own. Just to keep it home, he added, and Kai Shinzi seemed to accept the explanation. Still, his friend wondered why he needed a custom-made piece for something like that. He mentioned he had one ready to go, a 100 to 1 scale that looked quite impressive. But Li Daoxian didn't even wait for him to finish speaking. He flatly refused the offer, insisting that he specifically wanted the 200 to 1 scale. Kai Shinzi tried to argue that it would be far too large for a standard display. He even pointed out that he had a 144 to 1 model available right there in the shop. Again, Li Daoxian cut him off, refusing once more and insisting that it had to be a custom 200 to 1 scale. At this point, Kai Shinzi began to hesitate, sensing that this was going to be a real headache. He knew that whenever money is transferred that quickly, there is usually a catch. He sighed, certain that more trouble was coming, and asked what else he needed besides the specific scale. What other specific requirements are there? Kai Shinzi asked, already certain that whatever came next would be incredibly complicated. Li Daoxian was clear about what he didn't want: no spray paint and absolutely no plastic boards. He knew wood would burn far too easily, so he began to wonder what material would actually be suitable. I'm no professional here, so help me out with some ideas, he wrote back to Kai Shinzi. His friend suggested using composite panels, noting they were strong, lightweight, and wouldn't require any paint at all. Li Daoxian considered this, thinking that at least he wouldn't hurt his back while carrying the model home. It was a fair point. Modern composite panels are remarkably durable for their weight. He realized that once placed inside the box, the thickness would be magnified 200 times, which was exactly what he needed. At that scale, the swords and firearms of the Ming dynasty certainly wouldn't be able to pierce through it. A composite panel multiplied by 200 might even withstand a hit from floating artillery, or so he imagined. But then he paused. If it was going to be 200 times thicker, it couldn't afford to be too light to start with. Curious about the logistics, Li Daoxian asked just how thick these panels were in their original form. What's the thinnest composite panel you have, Kai Shinzi? Is it 3 millimeters? We see him doing some quick mental math, multiplying those 3 millimeters by 200. He suddenly realized that once inside the box, the walls would become a staggering 60 centimeters thick. That kind of thickness would take up far too much space, especially for the partition walls between the rooms. If the walls were that bulky, the number of available rooms in the aka house would be drastically reduced. He frowned at the thought, but Kai Shinzi shook his head, explaining they couldn't go any thinner than that. If composite panels weren't an option, he realized his only other choice was to use iron sheets. An iron sheet is only about 1 millimeter thick, and Li Daoxian began to run the numbers in his head once more. An iron sheet just 1 millimeter thick, that was the new plan. Once placed inside the box, it would become an iron plate 20 centimeters thick, which seemed perfect to him. Iron was an excellent choice. It wouldn't take up as much space as the composite panels and was significantly stronger. Alright, let's go with the 1 millimeter iron sheet, Kai Shinzi, he decided. His friend warned him that a model made from such thin iron would lack any real texture. It would give off the impression that the model was made of cheap materials, or so Kai Shinzi told Li Daoxian. But Li Daoxian didn't care about texture. In fact, using cheap materials was exactly what he wanted. However, he insisted that while the exterior mattered, the interior had to be incredibly detailed. Every room had to be built to a perfect scale, but Kai Shinzi argued that such a request was simply impossible. After all, the aka house consisted of more than 200 individual rooms. If he had to make all those tiny doors and windows with that level of detail, and make them actually open and close, the amount of labor required would be astronomical. The quote was 10,000, and Li Daoxian thought, good grief, that's expensive, deciding it was better to skip the doors and windows entirely. He figured he could provide the main structure and let the little people handle the doors and windows themselves. Li Daoxian, in that case, I don't want any doors or windows at all, he told his friend. He suggested simply leaving empty black holes where the doors and windows were supposed to be. Furthermore, he noted that the traditional aka house had flaws in its drainage design. He asked to modify it with a modern scheme, a request that nearly made Kai Shinzi flip the table in frustration. To Kai Shinzi, he was being a complete idiot. Who on earth considers drainage systems for a miniature model? He couldn't wrap his head around why he was worrying about drainage, arguing that the model wouldn't even be an authentic aka house anymore. He wondered what kind of collection value a model like that could possibly have. Li Daoxian, however, didn't give a damn, reminding him that he was the customer now. No matter how ridiculous his demands seemed, he felt there was no room for negotiation. Kai Shinzi muttered to himself, looking as if he were about to cough up blood from pure frustration. After rolling his eyes, he spoke up with a stubborn, sarcastic edge to his voice. He asked if he should just add wheels under the Aka house, install a motor, and a remote control too. That way, the entire Aka house could simply charge forward like a massive tank. Originally, he was just venting, talking nonsense to criticize his difficult client. But he didn't expect that when this mockery reached Li Daoxuan's ears, his eyes would light up as he slapped his thigh. "Damn it, Kai Shinzi, you're a genius," he exclaimed with genuine excitement. He told him to do exactly that, add wheels, a motor, and a remote to turn it into a super tank. It would be an unstoppable force, something completely unparalleled in the world. Kai Shinzi snapped back, telling him not to just go along with his sarcastic jokes. He argued that whatever came out of that process wouldn't be an Aka house anymore. It would be a toy for some very strange children, lacking any aesthetic or collection value whatsoever. Li Daoxian simply patted him on the shoulder and let out a loud, hearty laugh. He admitted that he wanted that strange toy and cared nothing for aesthetic value. In fact, he suggested making the tires even larger so it could handle some light off-roading. Kai Shinzi rolled his eyes again, convinced that his friend was still just putting on an act. Deep down, he was certain that Li Daoxian had finally lost his mind. Since the very creation of the world by Pangu, we can safely say no Kia fan has ever been normal. After a bit more complaining, he finally agreed to add the tires, the motor, and the remote control. Adding another 1,000 yuan to the total, Li Daoxian paid the money and they reached an agreement. Delivery would be in 1 month, and with that settled, our protagonist returned home. At the supermarket near the entrance of his complex, he picked up a random item for his project. It was a simple 200-gram chicken breast that cost him only 5 yuan. Once back home, he cut a small piece of the chicken and gently placed it right in front of Gao Yi. At that moment, we see Gao Yi returning from the pond with water jars, carrying 2 heavy buckets. As she walked unsteadily, the giant hand of the celestial god suddenly appeared before her. Gripping an enormous piece of chicken, the hand slowly lowered it into the very center of the village. And then, just like that, it vanished back into the heavens. The kind voice of the celestial god echoed from the sky, offering a gentle reminder to everyone below. He warned them that since they were used to light food, their stomachs might not handle too much meat at once. He told them to eat it slowly and calmly, a wise piece of advice, to be sure. Now, imagine from a scientific perspective, if that Aka house model were scaled up 200 times, how much would the weight increase? It would become as heavy as a real house, even if the wheels and motor were scaled up proportionally. In theory, those components wouldn't even be able to move such a massive structure. The rubber on the tires simply couldn't withstand that kind of immense weight without failing. But this Aka house doesn't just appear on a list once it is placed inside the box. Its main body still exists within our protagonist's landscaping box, which changes everything. It is still influenced by the physical laws of our protagonist's world, meaning the big tank can actually function within his landscaping box. There is meat. The celestial god has sent us meat. Gao Jie's shout echoed through the air, and soon, the entire village of Gao was in an uproar. The village sprang to life instantly, and everyone rushed over to see the miracle for themselves. It's chicken. This is chicken breast meat. Even though it was absolutely massive, there was no mistaking it. It was definitely a chicken breast. They were certain of it. A piece of meat this large must have been carved from a divine bird. It had to be the divine chicken of the celestial realm, which, to be honest, sounds like a very impressive bird indeed. We see that the villagers have forgotten what such things look like, as it has been several years since they last saw one. In the years when the weather was favorable, some people in the village actually raised chickens, but as time passed, things changed. Now, each year is worse than the last. The people have nothing to eat, so where would they even find grain? To feed poultry in the village of Gao was a luxury of the past, long before this giant chicken breast appeared. There isn't a single dog or cat left, aside from a group of hungry, howling villagers. Not a living creature can be found. Now, seeing a piece of meat excites everyone, and Gao Chugu reacted immediately. He went to find a knife, ready to cut off a few chunks of meat and take them home for a feast. Gao Jie spoke up seriously, reminding him that the celestial god said they were only used to light food. They couldn't eat too much meat all at once, as their stomachs wouldn't handle it. They had to take it slow. Chugu, you are the first one who needs to be careful, she warned him. Gao Chugu scratched his head awkwardly, wondering if such a precaution was truly necessary. The village chief stepped forward, certain that the celestial god's warning was directed specifically at someone like Chugu. Overeating will hurt your stomach and could even kill you, so we must make sure Chugu doesn't get too much at once. He surely won't be able to resist eating it all. Oh, Gao Chugu, what are we going to do with you? The village chief ordered that each person take only an ounce or 2 of meat, and that the children should eat it cold. The rest of the meat would be cut into strips and hung to air dry, ensuring it didn't go to waste while the people waited. To prevent it from rotting, a middle-aged villager approached the chief, worried because they didn't have enough salt. If the chicken meat isn't salted during the air drying process, it will inevitably rot. Instead of letting it spoil, he argued it was better to eat it all. He'd rather die of diarrhea, he claimed. To see such good meat go to waste for nothing was simply too much for Gao Chugu to bear. Yes, yes, village chief, I truly would rather die of diarrhea, he insisted. Anything was better than wasting it, and Li Daoquan was actually quite pleased to hear this. He didn't pick up the extra meat or put it in the fridge. Instead, he went back into his house. Once in the kitchen, he took out a packet of salt and placed it right in front of Gao Ye. He poured out a small mountain of it, and the villagers looked up to see a strange sight in the sky. The salt appeared out of thin air, as if the celestial god knew exactly what they needed. He warned them again to be careful about eating too much at once, lest they grow fat too quickly. Now that they had salt, they could finally preserve the meat, and it was such a vast amount of salt, too. Salt is incredibly expensive, yet he had given them so much of it without a second thought. Good heavens, it had been a very, very long time since they had been able to afford any salt at all. The villagers knelt on the ground once more, bowing their heads desperately toward the sky in gratitude. And so, the villagers of the Gao family finally had something productive to do with their day. We see the men brandishing their knives, chopping the meat over and over as they slice through those enormous chicken breasts. They cut them into thin strips, while others ground the massive amount of refined salt into a fine powder. Next, they rolled the chicken strips in the salt, coating them until they looked white and quite plump. After that, they hung them up, letting the dry wind carry away the moisture from the chicken strips. To be honest, this kind of work is rather exhausting, yet every villager wore a wide smile as they labored. That afternoon, smoke began to drift up from the village, as every single household started cooking. In pots across the village, a bluish-green rice porridge simmered with chicken, which they had carefully cut into small pieces. They cooked it all together with white rice until the mixture became thick and hearty. And, as a nice touch, they also added a few cabbage leaves to the mix. The final porridge was rich in color and aroma, leaving a flavor that, one imagines, lingered long after the meal was over. Old man Gao managed 5 large bowls in a row, and even the delicate young Gao Yi finished 2 herself. Watching this, Li Daoxian, our modern observer, couldn't help but swallow hard before reaching for his phone. He ordered some chicken soup and rice to settle his own hunger, devouring it the moment it arrived. Meanwhile, he opened his banking app to take a quick look at his current balance. He still had just over 20,000 yuan in his savings account. But deep down, he knew this amount of money wasn't going to be nearly enough. After all, just customizing that round carriage house today had already cost him 2,000 yuan. If he intended to keep helping these little people, the money would surely start flowing out like water. Realizing his funds were lacking, he opened Cuckoo and found a contact he hadn't spoken to in quite a while. He opened the chat and sent a single word. Brother, I'm Li Daoxian. 6 months ago, you reached out to me and asked if I wanted to take on some extra work. At the time, I refused. I was young and ignorant. If you have any design work in the future, and if it's doable, I'm willing to take it on. The price was negotiable, and the avatar flickered quickly. It seemed they had been waiting for those very words. I actually have a job right here. Some character designs for a video game company. They need them urgently in 5 days. For character designs for 3,000 yuan? To be honest, that's quite a tight deadline. When asked if he'd accept, Li Daoxian didn't hesitate. He took the job. Has the sun risen already? We see a new day beginning at the Shuangjin studio. Li Daoxian stretched lazily while rubbing his temples, feeling the weight of the long hours. He finally pulled himself out of bed, having worked until 2 in the morning for 5 days straight. He had pushed himself to the limit to create the specific character designs the game company wanted. After the client reviewed them, they naturally found a few small flaws to point out. He modified them according to their requirements, only for them to decide the first version was better after all. And so, the work was finished, and he received his 3,000 yuan. He made sure to confirm the money had hit his card before finally allowing himself to drift off. Once he fell asleep, he was completely out to the world. He didn't wake up until dawn, having spent those 5 days busy earning money to support his household. In the process, he had somewhat neglected the little people in the box, only stopping to provide food and refill Loki Lock's bowl. He provided water every day, though he chose to ignore the minor flaws and didn't keep a particularly close eye on them. But now, he was finally free of his professional worries. He decided that today, he would spend some quality time with his little pets. However, the moment he sat down next to the observation box, he felt that something was wrong. The little people of the village were all gathered together by the pond. As they argued in low voices, Li Daoxian quickly closed the window to make the room as silent as possible. He pressed his ear against the box so he could catch their tiny, mosquito-like voices. Someone is stealing water. Look, the water level in the pond has dropped significantly in just one night. Yes, look at these messy footprints. There were quite a few people who came to steal water last night. Li Daoxian looked closely, and, sure enough, the water level in Loki Lock's container had dropped quite a bit. In reality, this container is only 20 centimeters long, but once placed in the world of the little people, it is magnified 200 times over. This means it becomes a massive pond, roughly 40 zhang in length. For such a large pond to lose so much water overnight was truly strange. The water level had dropped by half a chi in depth. The water thief was either very skilled or, more likely, there was more than one of them. Li Daoxuan's gaze followed the messy footprints of the thieves as they stretched toward the outskirts of the village. But soon, those tracks reached the edge of the scenic model and led right out of the box. They were gone, and he couldn't help but frown deeply at the mystery. The greatest disadvantage of this box is that the viewing angle is far too narrow, leaving very little for us to see. We can only observe this specific area of Gao Village and nothing more. The world outside remains a complete mystery, leaving him with no idea of what is happening beyond the borders. Li Daoxian told himself he had to find a way to expand the view inside this box. After a few seconds of frustration over the limited view, he remembered that 5 days ago, he had installed a surveillance camera next to the panoramic box. It records on a loop, which meant the footage from last night could surely still be recovered. He quickly turned on his phone, opened the camera app, and pulled up the list of recordings. He had fallen asleep after 2 in the morning last night, so he only needed to check the footage recorded after that time. It didn't take long at all before he discovered the truth behind the water theft. In the dead of night, we see a large group of ragged people appearing on the screen. They were dressed almost exactly like the villagers of Gao, tiny, impoverished little people. Carrying buckets and using the moonlight as their guide, they crept stealthily toward the village's great pond. Working quickly, they dipped their buckets into the pond, filled them up, and hauled them back out. Then they took off running, as if they were fleeing for their lives from the village. About an hour later, the group returned, filled their buckets once more, and fled again. They repeated this 3 times, back and forth, for 3 long hours until dawn was nearly upon them. Only then did the group stop coming, leaving the pond's water level half a foot lower than before. Watching this scene unfold, Li Daoxian found himself at a complete loss for words. He put his phone away and returned his attention to the villagers' conversation. The villagers continued to argue about where these thieves, who were stealing the water from their village, could have come from. "This is too much," they cried. "This precious source of water was given to us by the great God himself. How can we possibly allow others to simply come and steal it? Where is the village chief? Let the chief say something. What should we do? Should we follow these tracks to find the water thieves and beat them? We must definitely beat them and take our water back. Otherwise, the great God will surely blame us for failing to protect the divine water he gave us." Li Daoxian finally spoke up, telling Gao Yi to inform everyone of his decision. He told him that there was no need to investigate the theft of the water. Gao Yi had been sleeping peacefully alongside the other villagers until that moment. Suddenly, he heard the shouts that someone had stolen the water given to them by the great God in the heavens. Recognizing the voice of the heavenly God, he sighed and looked upward. There, amidst the clouds, he saw the young and handsome face of the heavenly God looking down. He hurried to speak, saying, "Heavenly God, someone is stealing your gift. Are you not angry?" Upon hearing him shout, the villagers all turned to look at once. Seeing him staring at the sky and speaking, they realized he was conversing with the heavenly God. Everyone immediately covered their mouths, not daring to make even a single sound. Li Daoxian explained to them that the thieves were actually villagers from another village. They have no water to drink and simply cannot survive without it. And that, quite simply, is why they came to steal the water from Gao Village. "The little bit of water they stole is nothing," he declared. "I will simply fill it up again." He saw no need to hunt down a group of people who were quite literally dying of thirst. Shouting to be heard, Gao Yi quickly relayed these divine words to all the gathered villagers. The villagers immediately dropped their fierce, warlike stances and bowed deeply toward the heavens. Together, they praised the heavenly God for his mercy, his universal grace, and his great compassion. One phrase followed another, a mix of blessings and prayers that filled the air. As their voices drifted upward, Li Daoxian let out a deep sigh and began to reflect. He realized that, in the grand scheme of things, saving only 42 little people simply wasn't enough. From now on, he decided, he would have to save many more of them. And he would start with that desperate group of villagers who had come to steal the water. He only hoped his bank account would be able to keep up with his newfound ambition. That night, as the sky grew dark, the 42 little people of Gao Village settled in. They all returned to their homes to sleep, and the entire landscape box returned to its quiet, default state. But Li Daoxian was in no hurry to sleep just yet. He remained seated at his computer, browsing through historical records about the end of the dynasty. Occasionally, his eyes drifted back to the landscape box, toward the direction the water thieves had come from. It was late, 3 o'clock in the morning, to be precise. Outside his window, the city was still awake. He wasn't the only one who hadn't found rest. The nightlife of modern people is quite vibrant, after all. Cars continued to race along the road outside his window and through the streets of the residential complex. The night owls eating barbecue and drinking beer were still out there, shouting and playing drinking games. It was quite the scene. Li Daoxian eventually picked up his phone and ordered some barbecue delivery for himself. At that moment, we see movement near the northern edge of the landscape box. A tiny man dressed in tattered rags emerged and began making his way toward Gao Village. He hopped around for a bit before signaling behind him, and suddenly, a large group of little people appeared. Each one carried a water bucket, hunched over and moving as quietly as their hands and feet would allow. As they advanced toward the village, Li Daoxian closed his window, shutting out the noise of the modern world. Leaving the room in absolute silence, he pressed his ear against the edge of the box to listen. The box remained quiet, as the little people were careful not to make a single sound as they walked. Not long after, their leader reached the edge of the village's stone tank. He peered inside, and, despite his best efforts to be stealthy, couldn't help but let out a cry of surprise. Another little man followed him and whispered, asking Brother One what was wrong. The leader, whose surname was Juan, pointed toward the stone tank right in front of them. He said with utter amazement that they had clearly lowered the water level the night before. They had taken a large amount, and surely the people of Gao village had used even more throughout the day. By all logic, the water level should have dropped significantly lower by now. He told the others to look, then glanced up toward the sky once more. It hadn't rained all day, so he wondered how on earth the tank had filled back up. It was completely incomprehensible. He had no idea where the water in this pond was coming from. Brother Juan stood there, absolutely dumbfounded by the sight. But he was the leader, and he knew he couldn't just stand there in a daze without giving orders. He waved his hand and cursed under his breath, telling them not to worry and to hurry up and fill their buckets. He warned them to stop their endless chattering, lest they alert the people of Gao village and get caught red-handed. That would be a true embarrassment for everyone involved, so with those words, they got to work. A group of them rushed toward the pond, dipping their buckets into the water to draw it out. Some of the poor souls were so thirsty they even dunked their entire heads in. They submerged themselves, drinking with deep, desperate gulps. As Li Daoxian watched this scene, he felt a pang of genuine pity for these poor victims. His gaze drifted toward his bag of rice, wondering if he could help. He considered dropping a handful in, but then he realized that once the rice entered the box, it would become 60-centimeter-long giants. Their little wooden buckets certainly wouldn't be easy to fill with grains that size. We can't have them rolling rice across the ground like the people of Gao village did. Imagine the confusion of trying to roll those massive things all the way back to their own village. It was better not to give them such oversized rice. He didn't want to cause them any unnecessary trouble. After all, at midnight, no one should have to die from a rice-related accident. He decided to give them something that would actually fit in their buckets, turning his attention to the bags of flour nearby. Modern flour is ground into a powder even finer than sand, which was perfect. Even if the particles were enlarged 200 times, they would still just be coarse grains, nothing too terrifying. If he gave them this, they wouldn't start making wild guesses about where it came from. There would be no need for mystical explanations, so Li Daoxian reached out and grabbed a handful of flour. While the little men were focused on drawing water, Li Daoxian secretly and silently placed a handful of flour behind them, forming a small white hill. Elder Brother Wang was walking at the front of the group. His 2 buckets were the very first to be filled, and he prepared his carrying pole. He hooked the 2 buckets, hoisted them onto his shoulder, and then slowly began to turn around. He had to move with extreme care, trying not to tremble, lest he spill the precious water from his buckets. In this year of terrible drought, such a loss would break any man's heart. He couldn't afford to waste a single drop, but just as he completed his turn, he saw the scene behind him. The poor man was utterly stunned. He had no idea when this strange white mound, piled up like a small hill, had appeared at his back. Elder Brother Wang's mouth fell wide open, and for a moment, he simply couldn't close it. The water buckets he was carrying on his shoulder began to slip. They hit the ground with a heavy thud, spilling the contents of both buckets everywhere. The nearby villagers were distressed and cried out anxiously, asking what he was doing. They demanded to know why he had dropped the buckets and wasted such perfectly good water. It was a sight so painful that one felt like kneeling on the spot in grief. Elder Brother Wang simply stood there stiffly and told them all to look behind them. One by one, the villagers standing by the pond began to turn around. One turned and froze, then another turned and stood perfectly still. In the blink of an eye, the entire group of villagers looked as if they had been turned to stone, all frozen in rigid postures. They were all staring foolishly at the mysterious white mound that had appeared behind them. One villager opened his mouth to scream, but Elder Brother Wang lunged forward to cover it, finally waking the others from their daze. He reminded them that they were in Gao village stealing water, and they couldn't afford to make a sound. If they were caught, the shame would be unbearable for all of them. Elder Brother Wang cautiously approached the small, round mound. He pinched a grain, sniffed it, and whispered that it seemed to be flour. He told himself he couldn't be mistaken. It definitely had the scent of flour. However, the grains were quite large, and he wondered if the flour had clumped together from the moisture. Another villager nodded, certain that it wasn't damp, and admitted he had been thinking about something just moments ago. He had wondered why, all of a sudden, he could smell the aroma of fresh flour. He even questioned if he was so hungry that he had begun to hallucinate. He asked Elder Brother Wang how these flour balls could have possibly appeared there. None of them had seen a thing, as they had all been busy drawing water just a moment before. Elder Brother Wang grit his teeth, suggesting that the people of Gao village must have placed it there secretly while they weren't looking. It seemed to be the only possibility, though the villagers looked at each other, wondering if the people of Gao village were truly that kind. Where would they get so much flour, and why would they go through the trouble of shaping it into balls? It seemed impossible that they would give away so much flour for no reason, and do it secretly in the middle of the night. Elder Brother Wang looked to his left, searching for any sign of movement. He looked to the right, to the front, and then behind him once more. He nearly sneezed, as the raw scent of the flour was quite overwhelming. He whispered that the only explanation was that the people of Gao village had indeed given them this gift. They must have known about the water theft and decided to help them while letting them keep their dignity. He reasoned that they hadn't exposed them in person, choosing to let them be. They must have felt pity for us, he thought, and placed this pile of flower balls right here. But why here, and just for them to eat? The villagers didn't believe it for a second. It was a strange analysis, to be sure, and perhaps a bit ridiculous. And yet, they couldn't think of any other possible explanation for this miracle. Elder Brother Wang whispered for everyone to pour the water back and use the buckets for the flour. He told them to fill as much as they could, reminding them that not a grain could be wasted. He warned them to be even more careful than with the water, threatening a beating if anyone spilled it. The villagers didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the intensity of the moment. One of them replied that there was no need for Elder Brother Wang to even say it. If they were to scatter such precious flour, they would surely beat themselves to death out of guilt. There was truly no need for the elder brother to even lift a finger. The group quickly emptied their buckets into the pond, though they didn't dare use them while they were wet. They knew that if they tried to scoop the flour immediately, it would simply stick to the sides. And so, we see them standing there, holding their damp buckets out. They waved them constantly in the night air, hoping the breeze would dry them faster. After a good while, once the buckets were dry, they hurried toward the center of the clearing. They rushed to the small mound, filled 2 buckets with flour, and lifted them with the utmost care. They took tiny, careful steps, more so than the night their wives gave birth and they held their newborns. They were even more cautious now, fearing a single false step would send the flour rolling into the sand. In that moment, the pain of such a loss would be so great they wouldn't even be able to breathe. And so, the group set off, carrying the precious flour as they walked toward the outskirts of the village. Suddenly, their leader, Elder Brother Wang, set down his bucket and pressed his hands together toward Gao village. It was a deep, respectful salute, a promise that from this day forward, Wang Er would never forget this. He vowed to repay the favor in the future, though he had no idea which soul in Gao village to thank. He assumed it was some hidden master, for today, he had been nothing more than a water thief. Perhaps the expert didn't wish to be seen, which is why the flour had been sent in such a secret manner. He told himself that one day, he must return openly and honestly to offer his thanks in the light of day. Upon hearing these words, Li Daoxian finally realized the man's name was Wang Er. It was a name that felt strangely familiar, as if he had seen it written somewhere before. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly began to flip through the historical records, searching for the name of Wang Er, 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 searching for the name of Wang Er. He continued his search, looking through the records. Meanwhile, we see the iron plate standing strong, like a suit of armor. He had never truly dealt with something like this, and he paced around that massive iron slab twice. He gestured with his hand a few times, thinking that a piece of iron this large could be sold for quite a bit of money. It would need to be melted down to transform it into something else, but it was simply too large. He told himself he didn't have a furnace nearly big enough to melt it down. At that moment, Li Daoxuan's hands reached out toward the miniature landscape box. To him, the iron sheet was only 0.3 millimeters thick, and it felt as though it could be kneaded like dough. He twisted it to the left, turned it to the right, and then snapped it with all his strength. The iron sheet shattered. And again, he kept breaking it until the iron sheet was reduced to dozens of tiny fragments. The villagers watched in awe as the massive iron plate was seized by an invisible hand, twisting and deforming in midair. Then, with a sharp crack, it broke and continued to twist, warp, and shatter over and over again. The gigantic plate from before had now been turned into dozens of pieces of scrap metal. In their eyes, that was a solid iron plate, a slab 6 centimeters thick, to be precise. They simply stood there, watching it twist and break right before their very eyes. The scene was truly breathtaking. Overwhelmed by this display of divine power, the villagers began to kneel on the ground once more. Gao Jia quickly shouted to them, explaining that the great god was telling them not to waste their time kneeling. He urged them to get up and get to work, and with a collective cry, the villagers scrambled to their feet. It was time to work. They began carrying the iron fragments to Gao Jia's house, stacking them neatly beside the furnace. They needed to gather more firewood, though they wondered why the great god suddenly wanted them to forge armor. The villagers spoke in hushed tones as they hauled the heavy pieces of iron back and forth. Li Daoxian listened to them discuss the logistics of the transport and the deeper meaning behind this new task. Some debated the purpose of the armor, yet no one dared mention that stockpiling such gear was considered a capital crime of rebellion. It is quite clear that these villagers know very little of the world beyond their borders. To clear up any confusion, he decided it was time to speak with Gao Jie directly. He explained that forging iron armor was, quite simply, for their own protection. He asked if they remembered the last time the bandits had invaded their peaceful village. Of course, that was something Gao Jie could never truly forget. As he remembered his mother, who died so tragically at the hands of those bandits, his expression grew dark. Li Daoxian warned him that the coming days would only become more dangerous. He told him that food alone would not be enough to guarantee their survival. They had to arm themselves. Gao Jie then repeated these heavy words to the rest of the community. He shared the message with every villager, exactly as it had been told to him. The village chief was the first to react, realizing that the heavenly god's meaning was quite grim. Did this mean that even more bandits were planning to descend upon their village? Naturally, the women of the village felt a wave of fear wash over them. They wondered what they could possibly do, but the men understood their new purpose immediately. Hadn't the heavenly god already given them the answer? They would forge iron armor for every strong young man in the village. They also had the knives they had managed to capture from the bandits earlier. The plan was simple: take up those knives and don the iron armor for the coming fight. Besides, they were finally eating well and felt their strength returning at last. What was there to fear from those bandits now? That, they realized, was the true meaning of the god's message. The villagers finally understood, and suddenly, everyone had a job to do that day. Those who were fit for the task set off at once to gather the iron ore. They collected every piece they could find and piled it all up at Gao Ye's house. Others brought their own homemade charcoal from their homes, stacking it high in Gao Ye's yard. Inside Gao Ye's house, that poor little furnace was soon burning a bright, glowing red. Several young men stepped in to help heave the heavy blocks of iron into the furnace to be melted down. Then they watched as Gao Ye lifted his hammer, using a somewhat clumsy technique to strike the metal with all his might. One of them asked, "Uncle Ye, how exactly does one go about making iron armor?" He admitted he didn't know how to make anything complicated, but he did know how to make something functional. He showed them how to craft a simple iron plate for the chest and another for the back. By joining two iron plates with ropes, they could hang the makeshift protection over their bodies. It was a design that could block attacks from the front and the back just as effectively. It was called a lion dangia, though he wondered if it might be better to just forge a simple iron tube to wear. After all, how could anyone possibly use a knife effectively while wearing a rigid iron tube around their body? We see a group of villagers gathered by the furnace, locked in a heated debate over the design. Lida Akshuan frowned as he listened to their discussion, clearly unimpressed by the direction it was taking. The technical skills in Gao Ye village remained abysmal, even now that they finally had the proper materials. It was becoming painfully obvious that they simply couldn't craft a decent suit of armor on their own. He realized he had to find a way to upgrade their technology, and quickly. But no, improving their skills would take far too long, and a distant solution wouldn't solve their immediate crisis. It would be much better, he thought, to consider importing people with actual technical expertise from outside the village. Thinking of this, Lida Akshuan remembered that scribe who spoke with such an affected, scholarly air. Perhaps that man could be useful. Gao Ye, Lida Akshuan called out, his voice echoing. Gao Ye immediately looked up, his face filled with deep respect for the voice from above. As she looked toward the sky, Lida Akshuan could see her face with perfect clarity for the first time. She had delicate features and cheeks that were now slightly flushed with a healthy pink glow. She was truly a beautiful woman. Though it was a bit of a shame, she was less than a centimeter tall. No matter how beautiful she might be, he reminded himself, it was ultimately of no use to him. Gao Ye responded quickly to the call and went to find Gao Chugu to deliver the instructions. After receiving their orders, Gao Chugu and the three young men who had visited the county seat before sat down for a hearty meal. They packed their supplies and set off once again toward the distant county town. Meanwhile, Lida Akshuan picked up his Lego blocks, preparing to build a temporary wall for the village. It didn't need to be complex. He simply began snapping the blocks together, one by one, into a long, protective line. Next, he assembled a horizontal strip, placing it gently inside the box and around the entire perimeter of Gao Ye village. As for the villagers, they were still looking around when they suddenly heard a sound like thunder and felt the ground tremble. They looked up and saw enormous, strange, and colorful objects descending from the air and landing all around their homes. In an instant, these objects surrounded the entire village, transforming into a massive, towering wall, leaving only a single opening for a gate. This wall stood 2 zhang high and was terrifyingly thick, though the material was a bit unusual. It wasn't quite as hard as stone. In fact, it seemed as though one could almost carve into the surface with a knife. The people were stunned, wondering what was happening as their humble village suddenly felt more like a fortified city. They stared at the strange wall, which displayed colors as vibrant as a rainbow, a bit flashy for a fortification, perhaps. While the villagers were busy debating the miracle, Gao Ye climbed the stairs to the very top. Standing high above the city gate, she addressed the crowd with a voice that carried across the square. She explained to them that this was the wall the heavenly god had graciously provided for their protection. In the coming days, she warned, there might be many bandits looking to cause trouble for their people. The heavenly god wanted them to build a wooden gate to block the entrance and to send men to stand guard in shifts. If bandits were to arrive, they would take up their weapons and don their armor to defend their new home. Naturally, the villagers set to work immediately, eager to fulfill the instructions of their divine protector. Lida Akshuan watched in silence as they quickly assigned teams to fell trees and begin crafting the city gates. Their craftsmanship was quite rough. They cut trees the thickness of an arm, trimmed the branches, and laid them side by side. They lashed them together with simple straw ropes while, under the village chief's direction, they organized the rest of the work. The villagers also decided on a rotating watch schedule to ensure the village was never left unguarded. And so, we see two villagers taking their posts, carrying the bows and arrows they had captured from the bandits. They stood at the city gate, doing their very best to look like proper sentinels. It was a convincing sight, and we see that the village finally has the basic means to defend itself. That is, of course, as long as these people don't do anything foolish. If they spot bandits approaching, they simply need to barricade the gate and defend it to the end. In theory, the bandits shouldn't be able to set foot inside Gao village at all. As long as they can hold out until he arrives, everything will be perfectly fine. Next, we can only hope that Gao Chu, who was sent to the county seat, can achieve something useful. Meanwhile, we return to the city of Qinshan, where things are moving at a different pace. We find ourselves just outside the office of the county magistrate. 32 had dressed in a clean, tidy long robe and offered a respectful fist salute to Ye, the gate guard. Yet Yi replied quite expressionlessly, noting that the county magistrate had already given his instructions. Specifically, if it was 32 who came calling, he was under no circumstances to be let inside. 32 simply smiled, explaining that he hadn't actually come to see the magistrate at all. This left Yi feeling very surprised, and he naturally wondered what the man was doing there instead. 32 explained that he only wanted to find out if any major events had occurred recently. Back when 32 was a secretary here, he had been transferred not so long ago, a fact the guard remembered. The guard found him a bit annoying, to be honest, but he knew 32 was a good person who had helped him before. He decided it wouldn't hurt to give him a little information, so he lowered his voice to offer a hint. He revealed that the county magistrate had recently dispatched several different teams. Their mission was simple, to go out and collect grain from the surrounding villages. The third lord opposed the plan at that moment, and the county magistrate simply threw him out. Do you remember that? 32 asked, and of course, he certainly did. Of course I remember it well. It was quite an unforgettable scene, he replied. Yi explained that several teams were sent out then, heading to Gao Village, Wan Village, and Zen Village. However, we learned that the team sent to Gao Village hasn't returned yet. 32 whispered under his breath that there is a celestial god protecting that place. It was impossible for them to return to their beds. He feared the tax collectors had been treated very poorly indeed. Yet Yi continued, noting that those who went to Zen Village only managed to bring back a small amount of tax. It wasn't even the full amount, but the team sent to Wan Village was the one that collected the most. They beat the commoners of Wan Village and even went so far as to burn down a building. It was an old, uninhabited house, but it left the people of Wan Village trembling by the afternoon. Finally, taking advantage of the night, they burst into the commoners' homes and stole their heavy grain as tax. Upon hearing this, 32 couldn't help but cry out in shock. With a dull thud of his fist, he exclaimed anxiously, "The heavy grain?" He wondered how they could possibly steal that from the people. It was unthinkable, really. Had they never heard the saying that one would rather let their parents starve than eat the heavy grain? He was horrified that they would dare steal such a thing, stammering in disbelief at their actions. To him, this was simply a complete violation of any sense of morality. Yet he maintained an indifferent expression, seemingly unconcerned with whether the people starved or not. The court was putting on a great deal of pressure, and the taxes simply had to be collected. The county magistrate is going to have some very bad luck, it seems. If his luck runs out, he'll have to go to Wan Village, and 32 worried that all the brothers would share that same misfortune. He feared it was all over, certain that the people of Wan Village were on the verge of a rebellion. Yet he simply scoffed at the idea, wondering where a group of mere commoners would ever find the courage to rebel. 32, however, didn't dare waste another second standing around. He was right at the door of the county office, so he quickly turned and ran straight for home. The moment he arrived, he urgently told his wife and servants to start packing their things immediately. He insisted they had to leave the county seat and find a place to hide. In other words, they were escaping. His wife, a stout middle-aged woman, was utterly shocked by the news. She asked why on earth they had to flee, and 32 was quick to explain the dire situation. After 3 years of severe drought, the people had nothing left, yet the magistrate had sent men out anyway. They had gone so far as to steal the heavy grain directly from the peasants. This was going to cause a massive problem, and he knew they had to get out of there fast. If they were even a step too late, he feared they would suffer the same fate as the magistrate. It was a matter of collateral damage, really, and with no time to explain further, he told them to just keep packing. Lady 3, however, wasn't worried in the slightest, seeing no reason to fear a few villagers starting a revolt. She figured that even if they did rebel, they would simply become common bandits. She didn't believe they would ever reach the county seat, but the advisor whispered a warning. He told her she didn't understand, that Wangjia village was no ordinary settlement. There was a man there from Xi'an, a place called Baizhui, who had taken refuge with his relatives. The people call him Wanger of Baizhui, a man who has become something of a local hero. Armed with only a bamboo pole, it's said that dozens of men can't even get close to him. As we can imagine, he holds an incredibly high level of prestige in the surrounding area. If a man like that leads a rebellion, there is simply nothing they can do to stop it. Absolutely nothing. The advisor knew the situation was beyond their control. There was no point in staying. He had no intention of remaining near a wall that was about to collapse. Besides, he wasn't officially working at the county office anymore, so he figured it was best to keep his distance. We move now to the back hillside of Wangjia village, where we find Wanger of Baizhui himself. He stood there with a grim expression, looking out at the villagers gathered before him. Just last night, he had organized a group to go and take water from Gaoxiao village. The mission had been a success, and each person had even managed to bring back 2 buckets of flour. They were truly euphoric, and for a brief moment, the entire group was in high spirits. They walked with a spring in their step, but their good mood was struck by lightning the moment they returned. While he was away, the officers had suddenly raided Wangjia village under the cover of night, injuring several people. They had burned down a ruined straw hut and seized the vital grain from the villagers' homes. Several wounded villagers, with blood seeping through the bandages on their heads, wept as they stood before Wanger. They pleaded with him, saying, "Brother Wang, you must help us all make a decision." One man cried out that the essential grain from his home had been stolen. Even if the drought were to end and God sent rain, his family would have no seeds left to plant. Without that grain, his entire family was left with no choice but to face starvation. "The vital grain from my house is gone as well," another villager cried out in despair. They felt they were going to die anyway, and seeing this, Wang Ya grew furious and clenched his fists. "Brothers," he declared, "I brought flour, and everyone will use it to make dumplings." He told them to eat until they were full, and then they would deal with those officers once and for all. Everyone was stunned to hear this, as rebellion is a crime punishable by death, a heavy thought, indeed. Wang Ya roared at them, asking what they were afraid of if they no longer had any grain at home. What else was there to fear? In his mind, death was already a certainty for them all. Before starving, he argued it was better to cut off the head of that dog, Zhang Yaokai, the county magistrate. And only then would they accept death. After thinking it over carefully, the villagers finally agreed. We see Wang Ya reach down and pick up a handful of black earth from the ground. He painted his face black and then raised his hand, shouting at the top of his lungs. He asked who dared to kill Zhang Yaokai, and the villagers, painting their faces black, answered in unison. "I dare," they shouted. It was a grim, yet determined, cry for survival. The rebellion had begun. Once they had eaten their fill, they would march to the county seat to kill. Their goal was simple, to take the head of that dog, Zhang Yaokai. He looked around once more and realized there were fewer than 100 villagers gathered there. To be honest, this number of people seemed a bit small for a full-scale rebellion. He called over 2 young men and ordered them to step forward immediately. He told them to go to Zongjia village and Zhengjia village respectively. Their mission was to contact his 2 brothers, Zhang Wangdao and Zuan Sinfu. "Tell them that I, by Schwabwener, am starting a rebellion right now," he declared with conviction. He told them to ask if they dared to join, and the 2 young men quickly set off towards Zongjia and Zhengjia villages. Meanwhile, we see Gao Chugu entering the county seat accompanied by 3 other young men. This was only the second time he had ever set foot in the county town. And yet, his courage was significantly greater than it had been during his last visit. The first time they came, they were trembling with fear, but this time they appeared natural and calm. This is likely the difference between someone who has seen the world and someone who hasn't. The 4 of them remained very polite, asking people on the street for the residence of Zhuangxia, also known as 32. Someone soon pointed them in the right direction, and they navigated the alleys until they reached the gate of the Zhuang house. Gao Chugu raised his hand, about to knock, but he didn't expect the door to swing open first. It opened from the inside, leaving Gao Chugu's hand to pat the empty air, a bit of bad timing, really. Feeling a little embarrassed by the awkward gesture, he could only offer a silly smile. The person who had opened the door was, as luck would have it, 32 himself. As he opened the gate, he was still calling out to the people behind him to move faster. He was urging them to move things along, but then Zhuang Yun suddenly came to a halt. He stared at Gao Chugu for a second before it clicked. "You're that young man from Gaojia village." When asked for his name, the young man replied simply, "Gao Chugu." "Ah, yes, of course," 32 replied, the recognition finally setting in. After 32's eyes darted around for a moment, he seemed to understand the situation immediately. "What orders does the celestial god have?" he asked. "This humble servant is listening intently." Gao Chugu chuckled, realizing he hadn't even finished explaining himself yet. "You already knew," he remarked. "You really are an educated person, aren't you?" He admitted he wasn't quite like 32, or even like his own grandfather, the village chief. Apparently, for him to understand anything clearly, someone usually has to pull him by the ears, and shout at him for quite a while, too, at which point Gao Chugu simply scratched his head. He explained that the celestial god was having the people of their village construct iron armor. The god warned that, very soon, there would be many bandits running around and attacking people. And so, he had asked them to forge these iron suits of armor, supposedly to protect against the bandits. But there was a problem. The only blacksmith in the village, Uncle Gao and Here, weren't exactly masters of the craft, so their skills were somewhat lacking. The celestial god wanted 32 to find a way to recruit some truly competent blacksmiths. Upon hearing the words, iron armor, 32 found himself completely stunned. In this world, forging armor is the kind of act that usually costs a man his head. But he quickly realized he was focusing on the wrong part of the message. The real key to the mystery lay in the first half of the young man's sentence. The warning that many bandits would soon be running around, causing chaos. 32 understood instantly. The celestial god was implying that Bai Shuagwener was about to rebel. Just a moment ago, he had only been guessing that Qian Changlian might start an uprising. But now, with these specific words from the celestial god himself, he could be almost entirely certain that Bai Shuagwener's rebellion was truly happening. Good heavens, what a fright. 32 spun around suddenly. He began shouting to his family, asking why they were still lagging behind. He told them to forget the things they hadn't packed yet, as they didn't need anything. They had to leave right that second, a classic case of dropping everything to flee. 32 was frantic as his wife came running out of the house with their daughter in her arms. Each of them was clutching a large bundle containing their most valuable belongings. They rushed out and asked him in a total panic where exactly they were supposed to go. 32 bit his lip nervously and grabbed Gao Chugu's hand. "Brother Gao Chugu, right?" he asked, startling the young man with his sudden movement. Gao Chugu was quite alarmed, wondering what was wrong, when 32 spoke up. He pleaded for him and 3 other youths to escort his wife and daughter to Gao village. He asked them to beg the great god to watch over them, promising not to leave as long as they were safe. Without those worries, he could do his best and help the great god with whatever was needed. This was what he called mutual protection, though Gao Chugu didn't quite see it that way. The young man just stood there with a blank expression, not understanding what was happening at all. 32 urged them to go quickly, warning that they shouldn't stay there and lose their chance. Bai Shuagwener could attack at any moment, making escape impossible, and he told them to stop listening to his rambling. He told them to hurry, even though Gao Chugu still hadn't grasped the gravity of the situation. But we see that even a simple person like him can be very useful in a crisis. He had one great advantage. He was very good at listening to others, especially when a leader spoke. He was the type who always listened to the village chief's instructions. When the great god spoke, he listened to the great god's instructions as well. Now that Sancier was in charge, he simply listened to Sancier's instructions with a smile. And so, the decision was made. The 4 young men would set off immediately. They escorted Sancier's wife and daughter, along with a servant, making a total of 8 people. The group quickly made their way out of the county town. As they headed back toward Gao village, the 8 of them traveled along the Mianli road. Meanwhile, on a mountainside northwest of the town, hundreds of people appeared with blackened faces. Their leader was Bai Shuagwener, flanked by his 2 sworn brothers, Chongwan Dao and Zinmin Fu. Bai Shuagwener shouted at the top of his lungs that the county magistrate was wide awake and dangerous. He claimed the magistrate was destroying their sacred reserves and blocking their access to grain. Under the rule of such a man, he argued, they couldn't survive for even one more day. He commanded them to follow him into town to take the magistrate's head and kill the wealthy, wicked men there. His plan was to break open the granary and finally let the poor eat until they were full. He asked if they had the courage to follow him, and they all roared back that they did. When he asked who dared to kill Zhang Yaokai, a lone voice shouted that he dared. He asked again who dared to kill Zhang Yaokai, and another voice claimed the honor. Finally, he asked once more, and the entire crowd shouted that they all dared to do it. Bai Shuagwener laughed loudly and asked what they were all waiting for. With a cry to charge, hundreds of villagers shouted in unison, brandishing their shovels as weapons. They brandished sticks, pot lids, shovels, wood knives, and pitchforks as they charged toward the county town. And so, we see the official start of a glorious peasant rebellion, with Bai Shuagwener leading hundreds in a frantic charge. The 2 old soldiers guarding the city gates were utterly stunned, a consequence, no doubt, of the Ming dynasty's peculiar military system. You see, the garrison for Qinshan County wasn't actually inside the town, but at a guard post over 10 li away. Being simple farmers most of the time, these old guards knew perfectly well that no reinforcements would be arriving anytime soon. Could they really expect 2 elderly men to stand against hundreds of rebels? To be honest, the idea was absurd. Lacking the courage for such a feat, the 2 soldiers very resolutely crawled into a nearby ditch and stripped off their uniforms. They transformed themselves into 2 decrepit old civilians just as the peasant army came bursting through the gates. On the streets of the county town, the common folk were running about like headless chickens, desperate to find shelter in their homes. Guaner had no intention of bothering them, however, as he led his rebels directly toward the county government office. After they had passed, Sancier emerged from a small alleyway, glancing cautiously left and right at the now empty street. She then began to run quickly toward the district where the Jingu family lived. It turns out that after Sancier had sent her daughter and the others away, she had been preparing to find the blacksmith. But when the cries of battle reached her from outside the city, she realized that Bai Shuagwener had truly begun his revolt. She quickly shed her long coat and pulled on the coarse, thick cloth clothing typically worn by household servants. She messed up her hair until she looked like a middle-aged beggar, complete with a disheveled mane and a dirty face. Only then did she venture out of the house, wandering through the back alleys until she saw them. There was Gawainer, leading hundreds of rebels in a long line right down the center of the main street. They marched toward the government office with a murderous air, and she waited until every last one of them had passed. Sancerre took several deep breaths to steady herself, summoned her courage, and finally stepped out of the alley to make her move. Sancerre tousled her hair once more and continued running toward the district where the Jingu lived. Not long after, she reached the Street of the Artisans, a place that was both dark and narrow. The houses there were in ruins and sewage flowed everywhere. These were the conditions for those who lived here. They were the blacksmiths and the Jingu carpenters. There were also potters, and all of these people were poor, including Sancerre herself. After taking a deep breath, she knocked on a blacksmith's door while a peasant rebellion raged outside. The blacksmith was hiding alone at home, trembling, when he suddenly heard the knock on his door. He was so terrified he felt his soul might fly away, but he grabbed a knife and prepared to open the door. It wasn't until he heard Sancerre's soft voice that he finally gathered his courage. He opened the door and said, "Ah, it is Master Sancerre. How is it that you are here?" Seeing her dressed like that, Sancerre quickly slipped inside and bolted the door shut behind her. "Shoo, there are rebels outside," she whispered. "That is why I disguised myself this way." The blacksmith, Sancerre, lowered his voice. He told her not to worry about those rebels. They wouldn't kill someone like her. At most, they would kill the county magistrate. They would go after the magistrate and the chief secretary first. They would target those men, then the minor officials, and whoever else they called out. Then they would go to loot the granaries. So it wasn't their turn to worry yet. Blacksmith. "So, what is the matter?" he asked, and Sancerre quickly replied, "Lita, you are the best blacksmith in all of Qinshan County. But all the officials in this county, well, they don't even treat you like a person. Only I truly know your skill," she told him, certain that she alone possessed the vision to recognize his talent. As it turns out, the blacksmith's name was Lita, and he was indeed the finest craftsman in all of Qinshan County. He had spent his life working for the county patrolmen and the soldiers of the local garrison. Over the years, he had forged countless high-quality weapons and suits of armor for them. Now, we should note that the patrolman of Qinshan is merely a military official of the 9th rank. Each patrolman commands over 100 soldiers, yet the imperial court places no value on mere artisans. No matter how great your skill, you are considered an artisan, a class even lower than the commoners. The county magistrate, for his part, wouldn't even deign to look at a man like Lita. Why would he care about skill? Only the secretary, who handles the magistrate's affairs, would even know Lita existed. In truth, Sancerre is a kind soul who frequently speaks up on behalf of the poor. Lita had often received her help. Otherwise, in these times of war, he never would have opened his door. After letting her in, Lita spoke up, sounding a little embarrassed by the situation. He listened in stunned silence to the idea of serving a great, wealthy lord as a private blacksmith. To him, it felt like a step down. He worried that if he simply ran away, the consequences would be terrible. Sancerre pointed toward the chaos outside, noting that rebels were everywhere, killing anyone in their path. She argued that if he took this chance to flee now, no official would ever bother to hunt him down. Everyone would simply assume the worst had happened to Lita. Lita considered her words, his mind racing through the possibilities. Lita looked at her, weighing the safety of his home against the uncertainty of the road. Lita knew that this might be the only chance he would ever have to change his fate. Lita, 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 Lita. She was deceiving him, without a single thought for her own reputation. Finally, she had helped her celestial god trick a blacksmith, ensuring her master would now have an official lackey. And to be honest, this was much better than being a mere servant to a county magistrate. She gave Lita a reassuring pat on the shoulder, grabbed him by the arm, and led him out the door. Back in the county seat, the terrifying cries of war were still echoing through the sky. The chaos was concentrated mainly around the county office and the neighborhoods where the wealthy lived. From the sound of it, we can tell that the county office had already fallen to the attackers. The battle cries had spread to the courtyards of the rich, where private guards and watchmen continued to fight the rebels. Every now and then, the desperate cries of women could be heard over the din. Sancerre didn't even need to look to know that many women would be brutally mistreated in this chaos. She thought especially of Lady Wan and her maids, all of whom possessed such delicate features and fair skin. In the hands of those rebels, she feared the worst, and she couldn't help but sigh at the thought. The government stealing food is wrong, she thought, but what fault do these innocent women have? The government is certainly not good, but the rebels are hardly the ones who have been wronged here. The rebels aren't the answer either. In truth, it is only people like me, Lita, or Lady Wan who suffer. Doing things without shame in one's heart is what creates true momentum, and then she simply leaned into it. She took Lita's arm and urged him forward, saying, come on, we must leave quickly. Once the rebels finish with the soldiers and the rich, the chaos will inevitably spread all the way here. The two of them pressed themselves against the wall and ran like madmen. The city gates stood wide open, left completely unguarded in the chaos. He had barely taken a single step outside those city gates when Lita's spirits suddenly soared. He, a deserter, was finally free. He had finally escaped the government's control, just as the county fell into utter shambles. Meanwhile, we see that the construction of the gates at Gaojia village has hit a snag. The issue lay with the rope. Li Daoswan had built a wall of Lego blocks that was tall, grand, and wide. The city entrance, though deliberately kept a bit small, was still 2 zon high. It was also 2 zon wide, and a gate that size requires a great many tree trunks. Trunks that, naturally, must be tied together to make it functional. But the grass ropes the villagers brought out, regardless of quality or quantity, were simply useless. Grass rope is scarce as it is, and besides, these were all handmade by the villagers themselves. The production process is crude, usually meant for tying table legs, beds, or simple plows and pitchforks. It barely suffices for that. Trying to bind tree trunks as thick as an arm was a disaster. "The rope has snapped again, village chief," one of them cried out. Indeed, the rope he brought had broken with the slightest of tugs. He shouted for them to pull from over there and tie them quickly before they all fell down. The villagers were busy and utterly confused, struggling to make sense of the task. It was a complete mess, and Li Daoswan watched the little people busying themselves for over an hour. But because those 2 grass ropes snapped, the tree trunks they had tied in a row came loose. They collapsed, and so, our poor little friends have to start all over again. He wondered what he could use to help them, his gaze scanning the cluttered items around the house. Suddenly, he spotted a dust-covered fishing kit in the corner, and a light bulb practically went off over his head. With a sudden spark of inspiration, he realized that fishing line might be the answer. He looked at his high-quality gear, certain that this was surely the best possible solution for their predicament. It was time to give it a try, even if it meant sacrificing some of his own supplies for their sake. He carefully prepared the line, and down below, the young woman sensed the presence of the god and quickly looked up. Her face, quite pretty in its own right, was filled with an expression of profound respect and devotion. She asked what the great god commanded, and he told her to take this rope so everyone could use it to bind the gate. Li Daoswan cut a section of number 0.4 fishing line and let it descend slowly toward them. Gao Yi quickly called out to the villagers, and they all looked up to see a transparent rope drifting down from the heavens. To them, it was about a finger thick, looking very much like a giant, translucent cooked noodle. They all looked at each other in utter confusion, wondering what kind of strange rope Gao Yi was giving them. She explained that the great god had instructed them to use this to bind the wood and finish the gate. Naturally, their hearts were filled with a healthy amount of skepticism. But no one dared to speak a word of doubt until the giant noodle hit the ground and they touched it with their own hands. In that moment, their doubt vanished, replaced by expressions of pure shock and joy. This transparent rope was incredibly strong, far stronger than any grass rope they had ever braided. Even though it was only as thick as a finger, it held more weight than a grass rope as thick as a man's arm. They shouted for someone to bring a knife, eager to cut a section and put the wood to the test. The villagers grabbed their knives to cut the line, but we see that the fishing line was incredibly stubborn. The villagers' knives, to be perfectly honest, were quite dull. To cut through this material, they really had to put in quite a bit of effort. It took a great deal of work just to cut one section, and they were soon sweating profusely. However, they knew that the harder it was to cut, the stronger the material must be. With that in mind, the villagers happily set about cutting a few more sections. They tied 2 pieces of wood together and then made a test cut. The villagers decided to split into 2 groups and pull with all their might, trying to break it. But no matter how hard they strained, the fishing line didn't yield in the slightest. It was settled then. This substance was far more resilient than any of their straw ropes. One of them wondered aloud if this might actually be a magic rope belonging to the immortals. He said this quite unintentionally, but as a result, everyone around him turned pale with worry. They panicked, fearing that cutting a divine magic rope might bring some terrible consequence upon them. Gao Yi couldn't help but laugh, seeing just how uselessly frightened they had become. She explained that the great god had specifically said this wasn't a magic rope at all. To him, it was just a toy, and they could use it however they liked without worry. He apparently had plenty more, though hearing this only made the villagers feel even more reverent. If a mere toy used by the gods was this powerful, they could only imagine how incredible a real magic rope would be. Thinking of this, several villagers were on the verge of kneeling on the ground once again. Li Daoswan scolded them rather grumpily, telling them not to kneel down every single time something happened. Spend more time doing things that actually matter, Gao Yi said, imitating his tone and scolding the villagers with a playful smile. The men stood up, looking rather embarrassed by the whole situation. They scratched the backs of their heads and quickly got back to work on constructing the city gate. With high-quality ropes now at their disposal, everyone began working much faster than before. In no time at all, they had tied together a long row of sturdy tree trunks. They fashioned a sort of wooden frame which, once lifted, became a gate panel nearly 6 meters high. It was 3 meters wide, and they only needed 2 panels like this to complete a city gate that could open and close. Just then, we see the villagers who were standing guard at the top of the gate structure. They shouted out at the top of their lungs that Gao Chugu and the others had finally returned. They also noticed some strangers with them, prompting the villagers to stop their work immediately. They all gathered around the city entrance, eager to see the spectacle for themselves. Li Daoswan's gaze shifted directly toward the edge of the village to see who was arriving. Soon enough, Gao Chugu was the first one seen running back into the village. Following closely behind him was a man dressed in the simple clothes of a servant. Then came a pale, stout middle-aged woman, holding the hand of a young girl about 10 years old. Another person in servant's attire moved protectively at the young girl's side. Bringing up the rear were 3 of the young men from the village. The entire group of 8 people looked utterly panicked as they approached. They rushed into Gao village in a truly pitiful state, clearly exhausted from their journey. When Gao Chugu and his group had left early that morning, Li Daoswan hadn't yet placed the Lego block walls into the box. And so, Gao Chugu and the others had no way of knowing that Gao village was now protected by a wall. From a distance, they saw the village surrounded by a strange, gigantic, and multicolored wall. They stood frozen in the street, overcome by panic, having no idea what had happened to their home while they were away. The sentry at the city gate called out to the group, shouting, "Chugu, Chugu, you've returned." Gao Chugu felt a wave of relief wash over him at the sight of familiar faces. He ran forward, shouting, "What happened to the village? Why is there suddenly this strange wall here?" The sentry gave a mocking laugh and replied, "What do you mean, strange wall? This is a blessing from the heavenly god. How dare you call it strange? If the heavenly god stops feeding you, we'll see if you're still complaining then." When Gao Chugu heard this, his face darkened with worry, and he quickly shouted toward the sky, "Heavenly god, I was wrong. I have no brain. My words are like nothing. Please, do not take them seriously." Li Daoxian, of course, wouldn't care about something so trivial. He simply watched and laughed. Gao Chugu and his group quickly passed through the gap in the wall, which still lacked its gate, and entered the village. The 4 newcomers, 3 women and 1 man, looked more than a little frightened by their surroundings. They glanced cautiously at the people surrounding them before their eyes fixed on the massive wall in disbelief. "Gao Ye, tell the heavenly god. These 4 are the wife and daughters of Sangxir, Jejupu, and Yaoan. She went to find a blacksmith for the heavenly god. Please, ask the heavenly god to watch over her family." Gao Ye raised his head, preparing to ask for the heavenly god's opinion on the matter. Li Daoxian hurried to intervene, saying, "Yeah, the family of one of the villagers was killed by bandits. The house is still empty. Take Sangxir's wife and daughters there and get them settled in." Gao Ye responded quickly, approaching the wife and saying, "Please, come with me." Nupu and Yaoan didn't dare to speak, and the 10-year-old girl was still far too shy to say a word. However, the third wife proved to be a bit more courageous than the others. Seeing that Gao Ye had a kind face and seemed like a good person, she began to walk. She even dared to ask, "Sir, what is happening here in your Gao village? How can there be such a massive wall? This wall is even more impressive than the one at the county seat." Gao Ye replied calmly, "That wall is a blessing from the heavenly god. Our Gao village is protected by the heavenly god, and we possess many divine objects. Since you have come here, you will soon see it all for yourself." The third wife was taken aback, thinking, divine protection, divine objects. I don't understand much of that. In reality, the journey here had covered more than 30 li, quite a distance for a middle-aged woman. Being somewhat sedentary and overweight, the trek had been nothing short of hellish torment for her. During the entire trip, there were several moments where she wanted to collapse and simply stop moving. But remembering the terrifying war cries echoing from the city they had just left, she gritted her teeth. And so, she continued following the short, sturdy man, Gao Chugu. Now they had finally arrived, but it seemed to be just a tiny village, no bigger than the palm of a hand. If not for that strange, colorful wall, there wouldn't be anything particularly striking about this place at all. The third lady was silently cursing her husband in her heart when, suddenly, she looked up. And there, in the open space ahead, we see a long row of shelves filled with cured strips of meat, heavy with salt, drying in the wind. Normally, this wouldn't be such a strange sight, but imagine seeing hundreds upon hundreds of these shelves, packed densely as far as the eye can see. When every inch of the horizon is covered by shelves like these, the scene becomes truly surreal. It was, for all intents and purposes, a massive, large-scale production site for dried meat. The third lady stood there, completely and utterly stunned by the sight. She asked herself, is there not a drought? Is the world not living in absolute misery? Aren't the peasants supposed to be starving and driven to rebellion because they have nothing to eat? And yet, here were these countless strips of dried meat, stretching out before her. What were they? They even had enough salt to use it for curing, a luxury she couldn't fathom. It was truly scandalous, and the third lady found herself completely speechless. The servants of the San family were equally stupefied, wondering if the drought and misery they knew were even real. With their eyes fixed on those strips of meat, they looked as though they were trapped in a dream, or perhaps a very delicious hallucination. Gao Ye led them to a somewhat dilapidated house and told them, "For now, you will stay here temporarily." The house before them was indeed in quite a state of ruin, and the third lady couldn't hide her disgust. However, she told herself it was only a temporary hiding spot until the rebels finally moved on. She planned to return to the county seat soon enough, so, for once, she decided to keep her complaints to herself. It was then that Gao Ye heard it again, the unmistakable voice of the heavenly god whispering in his ear. The voice reminded him that this village was nothing like the county. Here, even if they had money, it was useless. He was instructed to give them 2 grains of rice, a small leaf of a vegetable, and a bit of nourishment. He was to provide a strip of meat and a handful of salt, letting them finally fill their stomachs for the first time. Gaoi returned home early to bring some food, setting out several different items for them. He placed them right in front of the third lady, who found herself quite startled by what she saw. She stared in disbelief, wondering what kind of rice this was and why the grains were so impossibly large. And the salt. Each individual grain was massive, unlike anything she had ever encountered. To her, they looked like nuggets of white gold, but Gaoi simply reminded her of what he had said before. He explained that in their village of Gaojia, divine things were actually quite common. This rice and this salt were merely mysteries granted to them by the great god. He told her she should simply accept them with gratitude, and this time, the third lady truly felt the weight of these divine gifts. She quickly pressed her hands together, offering 2 silent prayers toward the heavens. After that, she gathered the food, while Li Daoxian watched on, having no further instructions for the moment. Gao Yi, finished with his task, stopped paying attention to the third lady's group entirely. He stepped out of the house and made his way toward the village gate. Meanwhile, the third lady ordered her servants and maids to clean the room and prepare the beds. With nothing left to do herself, she took her daughter's hand and stepped outside to wander aimlessly through the village. We see that the entire village was surrounded by giant, colorful walls, which gave her an unusual sense of security. The massive pile of chicken strips in the open space near the house shocked her again, but that was only the beginning. Soon, she came across an enormous pond filled to the brim with crystal-clear water. This particular shock was no small matter, especially considering they were in the middle of a devastating drought. Everywhere else, the great rivers had run dry, and the trees and plants were nothing but withered husks. And yet, here in this village, there was a pond so large it seemed to defy the very laws of nature. This is simply incredible, even for a place like this. Everyone, get ready. 1, 2, 3. From the direction of the distant city gate, the rhythmic shouts of the villagers began to echo. The third lady turned around and saw 4 or 5 villagers pushing with all their might against a massive, newly constructed gate. They were trying to install it into the opening, but the gate was made entirely of stone and wood, making it extremely heavy. Suddenly, one of the villagers slipped and fell, and the enormous gate let out a terrifying groan. It began to tilt to one side, directly toward the elderly village chief, who was standing right in its path. The villagers cried out in alarm, while the third lady and her daughter watched, frozen in fear. But right at that moment, as the gate was halfway through its deadly descent, it suddenly stopped in midair, hanging there without hitting a single soul. The villagers remained frozen in their awkward positions, completely stunned by what they were seeing. After a few tense breaths, they heard Gao Jie shouting at the top of his lungs. He declared that the heavenly god had reached down and caught the gate himself. What are you all waiting for? Hurry up and lift the gate back into place. Gao Chugu came running from the side to help them heave the massive structure upward. He has been eating quite well lately, and we can see his body is growing fast, with muscles already forming on his arms. As soon as he joined in, the men holding the gate felt the crushing pressure ease significantly. Other young men rushed over to help, and together they carefully hoisted the gate back up. They finally installed it into the archway and secured it with ropes, letting out a collective sigh of relief. The third lady watched this scene from a distance, rubbing her eyes as if she couldn't believe her own sight. Just a moment ago, an invisible hand had clearly reached out to hold that falling gate in place. My God, my God. As it turns out, the third lady is a devout follower of Taoism, and whenever she has a free moment, she visits the local temples, burning incense for the Tianzuan and donating a bit of money to charity. She makes her small wishes, and, to be honest, she even knows several golden Taoist texts by heart, like the Tai San Laohan. She recites her incantations, praying for them to be fulfilled as quickly as possible. She recites them just like a Taoist priest would, though she hasn't always had the best of luck. She has been a devotee for half her life, yet in all that time, she had never actually seen a god appear. But this time, she finally saw it with her very own eyes. Without a single word, the third lady dropped to her knees with a thud and pressed her forehead against the earth. Now, we see 2 new faces. It seems the blacksmith, Lita, was tricked into coming here. Taking advantage of the chaos, the 2 of them escaped the county town and made a run for Gao village. After a journey of over 30 li, including a long stretch of mountain paths, they finally approached Gao village. By the time they arrived, they were both exhausted, hungry, and thirsty. They simply couldn't take another step. Li Sanshi points toward the village, shouting that they have finally made it. He notes that he hasn't been here in a few days, and yet, there is already a 5-colored city wall standing there. It really is incredible. This is what one might call daily progress, I suppose. As Lito walked along this path, he had been feeling more and more despondent. The area seemed so deserted that, deep down, he was starting to have serious doubts. But upon seeing that colorful wall, he stood stunned for a moment before being overcome with joy. He couldn't help but think how truly imposing the wall looked standing before him. It stands 2 zan high, proving the Lord here is powerful and clearly wealthy enough to paint his own walls. To him, it proves the Lord is so wealthy that he can afford to spend money on such trivial, decorative things. He seems quite generous, generally speaking. Lita couldn't help but ask how it was possible for such a grand city to exist here. Where exactly are we? He asks, only to be told they are at Gao village, a mere village. Lita could hardly believe his ears. He asks again, wanting to be absolutely sure of where they are. They insist it is Gao village, but Lita is skeptical. How could they dare call this city a village? If this truly is just a village, he reasons, then this wall must be some kind of magnificent family treasure. Lita asks with growing curiosity, noting that he has never heard of any lord named Gao in their region. His companion simply tells him that the lord here is known as the Great Lord. We see a massive metaphorical question mark slowly forming on Lita's forehead. He is warned that once they enter, he should ask fewer questions and observe more. He's told not to offend the Great Lord, lest he regret it. Lita remains confused, his mind still swirling with questions. He figured he would test the waters during the journey to see what the final result might be. Unfortunately, Lita could only focus on the basics. A Great Lord wouldn't say more, so he'd have to remember what he could. He claims to understand, and so the two of them walk one after the other toward the gate of Gao village. Only one gate has been built so far, and it seems there won't be time to finish the other today. A rather ridiculous scene, Lita thinks. He realizes the city is so new they haven't even finished the gates, which explains why the Lord is so eager to hire blacksmiths. He thinks this is his chance to shine, but then he notices the laborers sitting by the archway eating, and he is startled. These workers hold large clay bowls filled with white rice, cabbage, and aromatic pieces of chicken. He wonders what kind of wealth this family possesses if even the laborers eat like this. He didn't eat this well when he made armor for the magistrate. Furthermore, the physical condition of these workers is surprisingly good, unlike the emaciated people Lita usually saw during the 3-year drought. But this group of laborers looks full of vitality, which is quite strange. He didn't know that since the village began being fed, the villagers had rice and meat. With vegetables, salt, and water at every meal providing abundant nutrition, eating was a delight, and naturally, their bodies became quite robust. They were truly bringing things to life, as if stepping right out of the pages of a story. The discussions regarding the university were nearing their conclusion. The souls, in their own way, were looking quite good. It turns out the caregivers were also eating at that very moment, holding bowls of sour rice noodles with shredded meat while staring blankly at the landscaping box. As soon as 32 and Lita entered the area, they had already been spotted. Gao Ye spoke up, saying the great celestial god praises you, for you have done very well. He was elated, while Lita prepared himself to ask something serious. As the tone turned solemn, Ye asked 32 to introduce this new blacksmith. From this point, we assume Gao Ye is listening as 32 quickly begins the introduction. This man is named Lita, the finest blacksmith in Qin County, who has even crafted armor for the county inspector. Furthermore, many of the weapons used by the garrison soldiers are also his handiwork. This is what one calls a truly skilled craftsman. Lita thought to himself, noting with some surprise that the Lord actually shares the same surname as him. He mused that they might have been from the same family 500 years ago. Lita felt grateful that 32 was saying such kind things about his professional reputation. However, he was a bit puzzled. Master San is an important figure back in the county. Why on earth was such a man bowing and scraping before a young girl? To be honest, it was a confusing sight. After all, this girl was dressed like any other ordinary peasant woman. Lita responded with a surge of confidence, claiming that he was even capable of crafting three-eyed muskets. Gao Iya nodded, noting that Lita Akshuan's technique was actually quite impressive. It seemed he was the perfect candidate to teach the villagers how to manufacture iron armor. Forging iron armor? In any other context, that would be considered a grave act of rebellion. Lita felt a sudden wave of nerves, but then he wondered, did treason even matter anymore? If this person dared such a thing, they clearly had power, or at least the means to help him get rid of Jiang Yi. To restore his life, what was there to fear? He decided he would do it. Gao Ye then added that she wanted to give Lita an additional task. Upon hearing the word additional, he was ready to show off his expertise. A confident smile flickered at the corner of Lita's mouth. How difficult could an extra task be? There wasn't a weapon or armor piece Lita didn't know how to forge. No matter how complex the request might be, he was certain he could handle it. It was just a pile of iron. After all, with enough time, he could shape it into anything. If he were facing a high-ranking lord, he might have felt a touch of dread. But standing before Gao Iya, a simple peasant girl, he didn't feel intimidated in the slightest. He puffed out his chest and told her to simply inform the Great Lord of his readiness. There was nothing Lita couldn't build, regardless of what the Great Lord desired. He promised that as a humble servant, he would see the task through to completion. His only request was for the Great Lord's help once he had proven his worth. Give me a civil post, he pleaded. This humble servant and his descendants would be infinitely grateful to finally shed their lowly status. Because he felt so certain of himself, Lita Akshuan didn't hesitate for a single second. We then see a sheet of A5 paper being placed in the open space just behind the city gate. A large group of villagers were busy eating when they suddenly saw a giant, strange white paper descending from the sky. They quickly grabbed their rice bowls and scattered, not quite sure what to make of the falling object. They ran and laughed, joking that the heavenly god had sent them something strange once again. This time, however, it seemed it wasn't something they could eat as the paper drifted gently to the ground. It was covered in a multitude of strange, intricate patterns. Looking at it from the side, Gaoya pointed to the paper and told Lita that this was exactly what he had to build. She told him to go take a look. Lita, for his part, watched the massive paper fall from the empty sky in disbelief. He was completely stunned. He didn't react for quite a long time, standing there frozen until 32 intervened. The other man grabbed him by the shoulders and gave him 2 good shakes to snap him out of it. Only then did he suddenly wake up. The paper itself was roughly the size of a small pond. Lita stood on the ground and tried to look at it from the side, squinting at the markings. He could see what looked like a musket and a pile of various parts, but he couldn't get a full view of the design. He had no choice but to climb the 6-meter-high wall to look down upon the paper from above. Right there in the middle, it appeared to be a completely novel type of musket, and the patterns next to it, those were detailed diagrams of every single component for this new weapon. Lita Akshuin let out a soft chuckle. It was the perfect paradigm of early breech-loading rifles, the Shaspo rifle. This was the design. It turns out that Lita Akshuin hadn't been idle at all during these last few days. He had been giving it some thought, especially since he was the one providing the materials. What kind of weapon could actually be manufactured with the craftsmanship levels of the Ming Dynasty? To find out, he posted anonymously on his usual history and military forum to ask for advice. He asked the experts if they traveled back to the Ming Dynasty, given the skill of the local blacksmiths, and assuming they had modern materials, what is the most advanced weapon they could possibly build? The first response suggested a heavy sword, while the second was a bit more ambitious. Naturally, someone suggested the AK-47, claiming any family workshop can build one these days. They argued it could even be hammered out during the Ming Dynasty. The third response told them not to be foolish, as simply hammering out the casing wouldn't be enough. A poorly made casing is useless. If the precision isn't there, it'll just explode on the first shot. Besides, there was still the impossible problem of modern ammunition to solve. A rifled musket was the most reliable choice, as every time traveler knows. A fourth user chimed in, pointing out that the previous person seemed to have forgotten the author's premise. Since modern materials are available, that means they have access to rubber. With rubber to solve the airtight seal, why not skip the basic rifle and go straight to breech loaders? The Shaspo rifle is an excellent choice, as its precision requirements aren't nearly as high as an automatic. The blacksmiths of the Ming Dynasty could completely hammer it out by hand. Then came the fifth response, suggesting that everyone was missing the main point entirely. If you travel to the Ming Dynasty, you obviously buy some maids, and then spend your time chasing them around. Or perhaps spying on them while they bathe, since, in his view, they couldn't resist their masters anyway. He claimed he could play with them in 18 different ways, which is quite a specific number, if we're being honest. Lytic Swan, for heaven's sake. It was him again, causing a stir as usual. The comments were descending into chaos, and it was clear they were straying far from the history forum's purpose. After the uproar settled, Lytic Swan, with the forum's help, settled on the Shaspo rifle as his goal. In fact, he managed to obtain photos of the rifle, detailed design blueprints, and even images of the individual parts. He printed everything onto a sheet of A5 paper, hoping the blacksmith would be able to bring it to life. Standing atop the wall, Lytic stared intently at the paper, reading it over and over again. He turned it every which way, and by the time he finished, he was absolutely drenched in sweat. He admitted he didn't dare guarantee he could create such a small musket, but Lytic Swan told him not to feel pressured. He simply urged the blacksmith to try his best and see if he could actually pull it off. He promised to give him plenty of time, years, even, because some things simply cannot be rushed. If he truly succeeded, Lytic promised to make the man's greatest dream come true. For Lytic, his own dream was simply to live as a commoner, free from his current burdens. But this was no easy task, and as the words left Gaoye's mouth, he couldn't help but feel a bit insecure. He couldn't stop himself from shouting to the lady that it wasn't a lack of trust, but rather the weight of the task at hand. This was no ordinary project, and he didn't even know who the great lord behind it all really was. He felt a bit lost, but Gaoye just shouted back, asking if he still didn't understand after seeing that paper. He told him to jump from the wall to see for himself, which, naturally, terrified poor Lytic. Go on, jump. The lady laughed as well, encouraging him to take the leap and see the truth. Lytic looked down, realizing the wall was over 20 feet high, a long way down for a simple leap of faith. Did they really want him to jump? He wondered what on earth all of this could possibly mean. He had spent his whole life forging iron, a task that required a certain level of raw courage. His body was still strong, and he figured that jumping from this height might be fine, provided he was careful. He wouldn't necessarily be injured, and even if he were, it would likely just be a broken leg. If doing this could help the Great Lord free him from his lowly status, it was a risk he was willing to take. Lytic grit his teeth, deciding to imagine that the very wall he stood upon represented his life of degradation. To leap away from such a life, he realized, one originally had to be prepared to risk everything. he decided to take the chance. He grit his teeth once more and finally made the leap. The moment he jumped, he had already prepared himself to crouch low upon impact. He planned to roll to dissipate the force, but as he left the wall, he felt something strange holding him up. His feet stepped onto something solid, and in his utter shock, he found himself unable to keep his balance. He fell, his hands landing on an invisible surface that felt remarkably like the palm of a giant hand. Lydic was absolutely terrified, far too frightened to even attempt to move a muscle. Gao, he shouted out to him, telling him that he was now resting in the palm of the celestial god. Lydic felt as though he were flying through the sky, though his posture was admittedly a bit undignified. To be honest, Boris's current position didn't look much like a serious attempt at flight either. Before entering the village, 32 had told him that the leader of this place was actually a celestial god. At the time, he had been completely perplexed, unable to grasp what 32 was trying to say. But now, as we see him suspended there, it seems he is finally beginning to understand. Lydic reached out his hand and was slowly lowered all the way back down to the ground. Feeling a bit more lucid, Lydic slid down and finally sat on the yellow earth. His face was a mask of horror and panic, yet beneath it all, we see a glimmer of joy. That joy, of course, came from the realization that his lifelong dream was now within reach. Once his mind had settled, he shifted from sitting to a humble kneeling position on the ground. He spoke aloud, promising with all his heart that he would do everything possible to craft the musket. He acknowledged the task he'd been given, though he couldn't help but notice how complicated the device seemed. It would likely take a great deal of time, perhaps a year or two, just as the Lord had suggested. If Lydic could simply swing a hammer for a few days and produce a high-tier rifle, he'd certainly be a protagonist with a cheat system. But Lydic, being a man of the real world, knew that such a feat was utterly impossible. The Lord told him to take it slow and not to worry, provided he taught Gao Ye how to forge armor in the meantime. He was to take his time researching the musket and identifying the specific materials he would need. In short, the moment he successfully built it would be the moment his dream finally became a reality. At this point, we transition to a new scene, where the Lord asks Gao Ye if there are any empty houses left in the village. Gao Ye admitted with a touch of embarrassment that the only habitable house had already been given to 32's family. Hearing this, the Lord simply told them to wait a moment while he figured something out. He reached into his refrigerator, pulled out a can of Pepsi, and took several long, satisfying gulps. After a refreshing pause, he picked up a pair of scissors and got to work. He cut the can in half, transforming it into a small, cylindrical cup-like structure. Then, with careful precision, he cut a tiny door into the side of the metal. He added 2 small windows before moving this makeshift soda can house into an open space in the village. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the air, and the villagers felt the very earth tremble beneath their feet. And there, in a corner of the village, a peculiar little round blue house with bright colors appeared out of nowhere. The 4 simplified characters for Pepsi on the top were upside down, which, to be honest, looked rather comical. The Lord then told Uncle Lee that he would be living in this makeshift cabin for the time being. He promised that, in due time, he would arrange much better housing for everyone in the village. By now, our villagers had witnessed so many miracles that they hardly knew what to think. They were so utterly shocked by the sudden appearance of the house that they nearly dropped their bowls. In their eyes, the methods the heavenly God used to build houses were truly something to be admired. Meanwhile, we see the third lady, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from the sidelines. She bowed repeatedly, as if she were crushing garlic, trying her best not to disturb the flow of events. At this point, I should mention that the large A5 paper was collected later that same evening. On the day of the lady's passing, she simply couldn't stop herself, lingering there without a moment's rest. She remained there, caught in a cycle of movement that seemed to have no end. It was a repetitive, almost hypnotic state that continued for quite some time. To be fair, dwelling on every single detail would only slow us down and affect our journey through the story. So, for the sake of brevity, I will leave those less important details to your own imagination. The house was finally in place, but this new tin home was completely empty, lacking any furniture at all. The village chief brought a large bundle of hay inside, so that Uncle Lee would have a temporary bed. He also lent him an old quilt, while Gao Ye sent over a large plate of rice with chicken and cabbage. This allowed Uncle Lee to enjoy a delicious meal while the others were busy seeing to his needs. The rats also reported back to Lida Akshuan, bringing news of everything that had transpired in the county seat. The rebellion of Baishua Wang didn't come as a surprise to Lida Akshuan, though he hadn't expected it to unfold quite so quickly. After hearing the report, he found he had nothing to say, his thoughts turning only to those trapped within the city. He let out a heavy sigh for the innocent victims who had lost their lives in the heat of this battle. By this time, the sky above had turned completely dark. Lida Akshuan then took a metal sheet to temporarily seal the village gate, which, as we know, wasn't quite finished yet. With the day's work done, the villagers returned to their homes to get some much-needed rest. Zhaojin village settled into a quiet peace. There were no forbidden scenes to witness and nothing more to see. Lida Akshuan finally looked away from the box and glanced out his window, where the sky looked like a Zunin landscape, yet the city remained brightly lit. Our protagonist's nightlife was just beginning as he sat at his computer and opened Kai Shinzi's avatar on Hyuku. He sent a quick message. Lao Kai, how is my progress on the Wiguraka coming along? Kai Shinzi replied that it was still early and he was only building the frame, noting that these things can't be rushed. He told Lida Akshuin to ask him again in a month, which was a fair request, all things considered. Lida Akshuin agreed, knowing that the Uyghur model was truly complicated and couldn't be hurried. After that, he reopened his favorite military history forum and continued his habit of posting anonymously. He posed a question. If you traveled to the late Ming dynasty with a solid castle, cannons, and armor, what would be the next step? This fellow certainly knew how to strike a pose, mentally speaking, as he waited for the replies to roll in. The second response was a call for the moderator to step in immediately. The user demanded a ban for the idiot on the first floor, claiming they had endured his nonsense for far too long. A third response suggested a more violent approach. Kill the Yin party, then the Donglin party, and finally all of Lichushan's bandits. Kill all the Yin slaves of Manchuria, kill everyone who doesn't listen to me, and kill everyone who offends me. Then, with a group of obedient henchmen, establish a new country and sweep across Europe and America. The fourth response noted that if you have no ambitions, then Lida Akshuin's efforts are essentially ineffective. This person, it seemed, was actually quite a decent soul. After stealing the official grain, he had come back eagerly to return the favor. The people of Gaojia village watched as Baishua Wanger called out once again. A figure dressed in black appeared atop the city wall, looking down at the scene below. Gao Chugu climbed up, a rather foolish expression plastered across his face. He shouted toward the outside of the city wall, accusing him of being the thief who had stolen their water. Wanger felt a bit embarrassed, though fortunately, the darkness hid the fact that his face had turned red under the moonlight and torches. He admitted he was the one who stole it, but insisted that now was hardly the time to discuss such things. He pleaded with them to open the city gates and let them in. He explained that he had brought 2 carts of grain for them and would need to leave immediately afterward. Gao Chugu was a simple man, the kind of person who couldn't quite judge a situation for himself unless someone gave him a direct order. Lida Akshuin thought it over for half a second and realized that, of course, these 2 carts of grain could not be accepted. Furthermore, Wanger and his group could not be allowed to enter Gaojia village under any circumstances. We must remember that they were still in the very early stages of the peasant rebellion. The global situation remained relatively stable for the time being. The imperial court's control over the land was still quite strong, all things considered. If Gaojia village were to associate with Wanger's band at this particular moment, the consequences would be dire. It would only attract massive problems, and the word problems is something we generally want to avoid. The fragile Gaojia village simply cannot withstand any more trouble right now, to be perfectly honest. Lida Akshuin was just about to wake Gaoye, so he could relay his message right at that very moment. We see another person climbing up the city wall. It was Sanseer, who gave Gao Chugu a firm pat on the shoulder. He signaled him to stay quiet, and then shouted down to Wanger, who was waiting outside the wall. Hero Wang, we appreciate your kindness, but Gaojia village has no desire to join your rebellion. He reminded him that once he rose up in revolt, the imperial soldiers would surely hunt him down. He feared Wanger would have to flee for his life, and our village, well, things wouldn't exactly improve for them. Accepting him and those 2 carts of food wouldn't make their lives any better in the long run. And without those 2 carts of food, their lives wouldn't necessarily get any worse either. They were expendable things, really. But for Wanger, those 2 carts were the capital he needed to survive his escape. They were of vital importance to him, so Sanseer suggested it was better if he just kept them. It was a matter of making the most of one's resources, as he put it. With Sanseer around, Lida Akshuin realized he could afford to worry a little less. Wanger listened to Sanseer's words, and, naturally, he couldn't help but hesitate. Another rebel leader who had joined him in the uprising leaned in and whispered, "Brother Wang, what this man is saying actually makes a great deal of sense. Gaojia village had been able to give him a pile of flour last time, after all. This proved they weren't lacking food, while they themselves desperately needed supplies to take refuge in the mountains." Zhaozhen, another rebel leader, also spoke up, telling Brother Wang that it wasn't too late to repay their debt once they had settled down. "Just look at the current stance of Gaojia village," he noted, pointing out the obvious. They clearly didn't want to get involved with them, and after thinking it over carefully, Wanger finally understood. It seemed that Gaojia village didn't exactly welcome his gift of grain, which was a bit awkward, to say the least. Fortunately, he was a simple man at heart and didn't let the rejection bother him. He realized they didn't need his charity, and being a straightforward person, he chose not to complicate matters any further. He gave a respectful cupped fist salute toward the city wall and shouted that, in that case, he would take his leave. Wanger promised he would always remember the favor he owed to Gaojia village. After saying his piece, he gave a sharp gesture with his hand to his men. "Let's go," he commanded, but as Sanseer watched him walk away, he suddenly called out, "Hero Wang," he shouted, causing Wanger to stop in his tracks and turn around. Sanseer then asked loudly, "How are the wives of the rich and powerful doing?" The question about the noble women from the county seat hit Wanger like a bolt of lightning, leaving him frozen for several seconds before he finally turned his head. Eventually, the group disappeared into the night, and Lida Akshuin noticed they were heading in the same direction they had retreated to after the water raid. There was supposed to be a Wong village over there, though he wasn't quite sure how far it was from our own village. After that brief moment of excitement, a familiar quiet returned to Gaojia village. Sancerre climbed down from the wall, with Gao Chugu following closely behind him. By then, a large crowd of villagers had already gathered at the base of the wall. It seems Wanger's earlier words had served as a wake-up call for many of the people there. While only a few had actually made it up to the wall, Sancerre began to vent his frustrations to the rest of the villagers. Our Gao village has walls, it's true, but we see that it lacks any real defenses. Fortunately, Wanger came along this time. His shouting served as a much-needed wake-up call for everyone. If other bandits were to come and silently throw grappling hooks to scale the wall, wouldn't we all be dead? We wouldn't even know how we died, a complaint that, to be honest, was exactly what Lida Akshuin had been thinking. The village chief stepped forward, slowly shaking his head at the grim prospect. He pointed out that for a night watch, they only had empty lanterns and nothing more. Even though the village is small, lining the walls with lanterns would require dozens of them. Where exactly were they supposed to get the lamp oil? Sancerre frowned at the question. He admitted the chief had a point, but then he immediately smiled and gave him a playful scolding. He told him he had the heart of a lazy man, reminding him that Gao village is protected by a celestial god. Tomorrow morning, he suggested, everyone should make sure to kneel properly. If they worship the heavens, wouldn't the oil just appear? The villagers considered this carefully. They agreed that the celestial god seemed to enjoy giving everyone food early in the morning. If everyone knelt and bowed before him at that exact moment, perhaps they could simply ask for a little oil, which, in this village, was a perfectly logical plan. Lida Akshuin watched them, not quite knowing whether to laugh or cry at their simple faith. He wondered why they should wait until morning when he could provide the oil right now. He went into his own kitchen and pulled out another large barrel of vegetable oil. After that, he searched around until he found several mineral water bottle caps. His plan was to fill a bottle cap with oil and place it carefully into the box. But before we see him head to the kitchen, a figure suddenly jumped out from the crowd of little people. It was a middle-aged woman, Sancerre's third wife, who began pointing at the villagers with a tone full of complaints. She told them that although she hadn't been in the village long, there were a few things she needed to say plainly. She scolded the men, telling them they were being far too disrespectful toward the great celestial god. The villagers gathered around, wondering how they had been disrespectful, while the third wife cursed them under her breath. She looked at this group of uncultured peasants, and, realizing they truly knew no better, she found herself momentarily speechless. She simply hummed, reminding them that the celestial god had manifested in the village again and helped them immensely. And yet, she asked, had they built him a temple? Had they even built him a small shrine? Had they offered him any incense? To her, it seemed that whenever they called upon the gods, they only knew how to kneel and beg, asking for this and that, greedy and utterly insatiable. But as she pointed out, they didn't even have a proper ceremony to show their gratitude. As she launched this series of questions, the villagers stood there, completely stunned. Seeing that these people had truly never seen the world, the third wife couldn't help but instruct them on the ways of the gods. She explained that when monks ask Buddha for blessings, they must first bathe and change their clothes. They must first ring the bell and then silently recite the sacred sutras. And even then, Buddha might not listen. So if they truly wanted grace from the celestial god, they should at least consider ringing a bell, burning some incense, and lighting a candle. They had to follow the rituals. As soon as she said this, the villagers had a sudden realization. Yes. It seemed they really hadn't been respectful enough to their benefactor. They wondered where that left the dignity of their god. While Lida Akshuin listened to all of this from above, he almost burst out laughing, as these rituals made absolutely no sense to him. But then, a metaphorical light bulb suddenly flickered to life in Lida Akshuin's head. Perhaps these rituals did have a purpose, simply because these little people were just so small. Their voices were so faint that Lida Akshuin often struggled to hear a single word they said. Even if they shouted toward the heavens with all their might, he might still miss it. If they were to strike a massive bell whenever they needed him, it would be much easier to hear them. Meanwhile, the third wife continued her stern lecture to the gathered villagers. She commanded that by tomorrow morning, everyone must wash themselves and put on their cleanest clothes. She even ordered the blacksmith to skip 2 nights of sleep to forge a great bell by dawn. After the third wife laid out these strict arrangements, not a single villager dared to pull a face. Naturally, no one raised an objection, and they all listened with perfect, obedient silence. Lida Akshuin watched calmly from the sky as the little people discussed these grand plans. He found the whole thing quite amusing, and though he planned to give them the oil, there was no rush. He decided he would wait to see how things looked in the morning before handing it over. Furthermore, his gaze happened to linger on 32 and the third wife. He realized that having these two in the village was turning out to be a great help to him. It reminds me of the cat I have at home, the one in my profile picture, who has been with me for years. I spoil him quite a bit, to be honest, as I am very fond of him. I love watching him pounce and play with his toys. It's a simple joy to witness. Whatever he wants to eat, I buy it for him, much like our god and his tiny villagers. Cat treats, canned food, even cat lollipops. Nothing is too good for him. Recently, I have even started planting catnip specifically for his enjoyment. And of course, if he ever falls ill, I take him straight to the vet. I have already spent thousands on him, which, naturally, was worth every penny. This is the kind of treatment he receives when he behaves himself. But if he misbehaves, well, he might just receive a little swat from me. This is simply the mindset of a pet owner who also possesses a sound mind. A cat is a creature that cannot provide for itself. It is small, fragile, and utterly dependent. In reality, the village of Gaojiakuan is not a formal organization. It has always been more like a pile of loose sand. Aside from the village chief, who holds some authority through prestige, the others have no real mutual affiliation. They are independent individuals. Whenever Akshuan gives them food, the villagers simply divide it up at random. Each person takes a pile home, leaves a bit extra for Gaojia, and then no one gives it another thought. There is a distinct lack of planning, much like my cat, though for them, this lack of structure is a great hardship. And the truth is, when the newcomers arrived at Gaojiakuan, no one was there to receive them. Akshuan himself had to speak up just so Gaojia would find them lodging and send them some food. To be perfectly honest, it was a bit annoying. These aren't the sorts of details a god should have to manage. But now that 32 is here, we see that the situation has suddenly changed. 32 has just successfully persuaded the tax collectors to retreat and leave the village in peace. And now, the third wife has also solved the problem of how the villagers can best summon their protector. Suddenly, two major problems have been solved for Akshuan, leaving him feeling quite at ease as he recalls a forum discussion. He reflected that what the user on the fourth floor of the forum said actually made a great deal of sense. For the foreseeable future, his primary focus should be on gathering more useful people. That was the general direction he needed to take. After the third wife finished reprimanding the villagers, we see the crowd finally begin to disperse. While most returned to their homes to continue sleeping, Gaojia and the two blacksmiths gathered at Gaojia's house. There, they immediately began investigating how they might construct a bell in the middle of the night. Of course, one cannot simply forge a proper bell in a single night. That would be impossible. They could only manage something temporary and simple, like a large iron tube, to serve the purpose. The two men lit the furnace, and while they were busy, Lida began teaching the technique to Gaojia. He had no fear of the apprentice eventually outshining the master and leaving him with nothing. After all, he had already decided that once he regained his status as a commoner, he would never touch a hammer again for as long as he lived. He told himself that even if he were starving, he would rather jump off a cliff than go back to that life. Early the next morning, well before dawn, Gaojia was pressured by the third wife into taking a bath. In the village, the only place suitable for bathing is a large communal pond. During the day, the pond is crowded with people, so they wouldn't dare try to bathe there openly. But while it was still dark and the villagers were not yet awake, they figured it was best to take a quick bath unseen. Of course, they have no idea that outside the box, a camera with night vision is watching through the glass. Recording 24 hours a day, it captures people in rather awkward positions, a situation that, if they knew about it, would likely leave that fellow from the forum feeling quite euphoric. And so, after the bath was finished, the third wife produced a robe as white as snow for him to wear. The garment looked a bit too large on Gaojia, but it was a start. It is a bit spacious, to be sure, but that isn't really a major problem. After all, he has no need to go out and work in the fields today. If the clothes don't fit quite right, he simply needs to move a little more slowly. Gaojia stuck out his tongue. He was sweltering, as it was already the middle of July. Summer had just arrived, and the temperature was becoming truly terrible. The fabric of his new robe didn't breathe at all, and the longer he wore it, the worse it felt. Still, he had to endure the heat, while the third wife stepped in to help him. Tugging at the fabric and smoothing out the wrinkles, she leaned in and whispered to him. She reminded him that they must be absolutely respectful toward the great god. After inviting him to join them today, they would need to ask him a very important question. They needed his official title so that they might finally build a temple in his honor. And, of course, to carve a statue. Gaojia simply nodded obediently in response. He understood perfectly as the third wife took out her makeup box and carefully applied every stroke. As she began to do Gaojia's makeup, we see Li Guin suddenly startled awake by the sound of a bell. Last night, he had been browsing history and military forums, researching materials about the end of the Ming dynasty. Without realizing it, he had stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning, so, naturally, he couldn't wake up early. That is, until a loud and rather unpleasant ringing of bells began to echo in his ears. He shook his head and, looking quite dazed, managed to drag himself out of bed. His desk was right next to the bed, and he realized the ringing was coming from inside the landscape box. He shook off the last of his sleep, and as his mind slowly cleared, he remembered everything that happened last night. He realized that this sound, like a broken gong, must be the villagers calling out to the great god. He rolled over in bed and slowly dragged himself toward the edge. Stretching his neck, he leaned over the landscape box to take a look inside. The little people are quite lively today. All 42 villagers are there, along with the 3 members of the family of 32, including the servants and the newly arrived blacksmith. Lida, there are 48 people in total. They are currently gathered in a giant square, arranged in a rather complex formation. They are also making all sorts of elaborate gestures with their hands. As for the third wife, who was already young and beautiful, the makeup has truly transformed her. She is now a dazzling beauty, charming, elegant, and quite lovely to look at. In the modern era, she would undoubtedly be considered a goddess. The admirers surrounding her would likely form an entire cavalry regiment. Her devoted followers could easily fill a whole company. Even the wealthy young men of the city would probably form their own platoon just to see her. Even a famous director like VNG would feel compelled to write her a message. Something along the lines of, "I miss you, no doubt." Li Guin found the whole scene rather interesting. He thought to himself that this young lady was becoming more beautiful by the day. To be perfectly honest, her charm was becoming hard to ignore. He noticed their movements were inspired by the forum posts he'd seen, though they weren't exactly standard. It was obvious, of course, that they had been practicing at the very last minute. First, they venerated the heavens and then poured out wine, though, in reality, it was just water. They sprinkled it onto the ground, and then, as one, they knelt. The 46 people standing behind followed suit, kneeling together in the dirt. And then, Gao Ye began to recite the prayers. These prayers were meant for the family of 32 and the third wife. Liang Yi had written them down for him to memorize, and now he was putting that study to the test. But clearly, he hadn't mastered the lines. He stuttered and stumbled 3 times in a single sentence. Li Daoxian, for his part, had very little interest in listening to these mystical prayers, so he simply tuned them out. After a short while, Gao Ye called out, daring to ask for the name of the great heavenly god. He explained they wished to build a temple and carve a statue in his honor. Li Daoxian decided to answer, feeling a bit like he was playing a game of house with them. When Gao Ye heard the voice, he was filled with joy and turned to tell the third lady that the great god had responded. His name is Li Daoxian. Daoxian. The third lady listened intently to those 2 words. She was absolutely ecstatic. It was clear to her now that he was a Taoist god. Being a believer in Taoism herself, she had been a little worried the great god might turn out to be a Buddhist bodhisattva. That would have been rather embarrassing, like burning incense to the wrong deity entirely. But now, it was basically confirmed that he was indeed Taoist. The third lady said nothing more and immediately followed the lead of the others. They all offered their sacrifices to greet the one they called Daoxian Tianzuan. Li Daoxian found the whole thing quite amusing. It was all very interesting, to say the least. And just like that, he went from being an anonymous great celestial god to the newly named Daoxian Tianzuan. Now that he actually has a name, he feels a little bit awkward about the whole thing. Gao Ye began to speak clumsily, likely reciting a speech the third lady had carefully taught him. It seems they had prepared 2 different versions, one Taoist and one Buddhist, just to be safe. Since he is now reciting the Taoist version, they first thanked Daoxian Tianzuan for the city wall before making their request. They explained that they need people to stand guard at night and light lanterns all along the perimeter. Naturally, those lanterns require a great deal of oil, so they begged the great celestial god to provide some. To be honest, Li Daoxian finds this entire game of playing house rather amusing. Amidst the man's coughing and stuttering, Li Daoxian reached for his jug of vegetable oil. He poured a single capful into the lid of a water bottle and slowly placed it down in front of Gao Ye. Now, a simple water bottle cap isn't exactly large by our standards. It is barely an inch in diameter and less than half an inch deep. But to these tiny people, it appeared as a massive pool, several yards wide and deep. This vast pool was now filled to the brim with vegetable oil refined by modern technology. We see the villagers' noses twitching slightly as the scent reaches them. They recognize it immediately. They are standing before a literal lake of rapeseed oil. 3 years before the drought began, the villagers actually had the chance to plant rapeseed. Back then, they could extract a bit of oil to use for special festivities. But after 3 years of relentless drought, even basic food crops couldn't survive, let alone anything else. Who could possibly afford to grow a cash crop like that? Seeing a pool of oil large enough to bathe in, the villagers were absolutely euphoric. Gao Chugu was the first to speak, exclaiming that they would use this to light the lanterns. Another voice chimed in, suggesting they should simply eat it all instead. The village chief reprimanded him immediately, telling him to shut his mouth. He asked if they hadn't seen the large group of rebels passing by the outskirts of the village just last night. They only think of eating, but since food is no longer scarce, they must worry about how to protect themselves. Gao raised his voice, announcing that the celestial being had spoken. They would eat half of the oil. The remaining half would be used for lanterns, lighting a perimeter on the walls every night for the patrols. There was no room for negligence. If bandits were spotted, the sentinels would ring the alarm bell. Everyone would take up their weapons to defend the city gates and keep the bandits from entering. The villagers obeyed, and Gao added that the celestial being ordered Master 3 to take charge of the rapeseed oil. As for the rest of them, they were to continue with their assigned tasks. The construction of the city gates had to continue, as did the work on the iron armor. And Li Da's new firearm was also to receive a great deal of attention. There was much to be done, though the villagers were a bit surprised to hear the oil was being given to Master 3. They had assumed the celestial being would divide it among everyone, as he usually did. It was truly strange that this time he didn't share it, but chose to entrust it all to Master 3. Despite their curiosity, no one dared to question the decision, and they obediently dispersed. As they went off to their duties, Master 3 rejoiced in his heart. He told himself that the celestial being must have noticed his performance. He had been given a real job. His path to success was finally beginning. He imagined helping with small things first, then larger tasks, until he eventually became the celestial being's right hand. To him, that would be incredible, far more impressive than being a mere scribe in the county magistrate's office. Master 3 was then greeted by Lida Akshuan, though we can assume Gao Yi was the one relaying the message. Master 3 immediately clasped his hands together in an obedient gesture, ready to receive his orders. He eagerly wanted to know what the celestial being commanded of him next. He wondered why the oil management was left to him, noting that the villagers of Gaojia were like a handful of loose sand. Each one went their own way, and none of them knew how to read, write, or perform basic calculations. Assigning oil for the lamps every night was a delicate task. If the villagers managed it, it would surely be a disaster. In just a few days, there would likely be errors and omissions popping up everywhere. He was certain someone would eventually steal the lamp oil and take it home for their own personal use. The response was a simple hum of approval. It was enough that he understood the gravity of the situation. Lida Akshuan was then told to stop trying to summarize everything using fancy idioms. He ducked his head in embarrassment, as he often used idioms to show others how cultured he was, or so he thought. But before the celestial being, his meager education felt like a tiny firefly trying to compete with the sun and the moon. No matter how much he tried to fake it, it simply didn't look right in such presence. He was told that such a long explanation wasn't necessary, which was a fair point, really. Lida Akshuan had realized long ago why he felt the need to add a flourish to every single sentence. The celestial being brushed it off with a smile and asked if he realized what the village of Gaojia lacked most. Master 3 responded without a moment's hesitation, suggesting that perhaps they lacked people. With a command to move out, Master 3 was overjoyed and hurriedly made a deep, respectful bow to the empty air. "Venerable Celestial, please do not worry," he said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "In this era of the dynasty, we must remember that flour is often more valuable than gold itself." With such a prize in hand, the little clerk felt confident he could persuade and recruit plenty of people. Lida Akshuan was told that his plan needed to be heard first, before any action was taken. The celestial being wanted to know his concrete ideas regarding the nearby Wan village. He also mentioned Zen village and Zan village, the three settlements closest to their current location. Many of their residents had joined Wayner's rebel army, yet there were always those who chose to stay behind. They had no desire to be bandits, though life for those who remained was surely harder than ever before. The little clerk planned to visit these villages, certain that a single bag of flour would be all he needed. It turned out that his plan aligned perfectly with the celestial being's own thoughts on the matter. Having a man like this under his command was certainly going to save him a great deal of trouble. He had studied many historical documents, and they all contained very similar analyses of such situations. The county magistrate's advisor is the practical one, while the magistrate himself is usually just the theorist. Typically, the county magistrate handles the grand vision and the general planning of the region. Once the government orders are considered, he simply hands them off to the advisor at his side. It is the advisor, after all, who bears the heavy responsibility of actually making things happen. Every concrete detail is supervised by the advisor, who puts in all the real effort behind the scenes. While the magistrate speaks, the secretary runs until his legs break, making the secretary much more capable in practice. High-level policy considerations are more the magistrate's domain, but the real work happens elsewhere. And so, the task was left entirely to him. With that settled, what else was there to say? He stopped speaking, and Gao Jia watched as his face slowly faded away into the clouds. It seemed he was no longer tethered to the earth, and only then did Tianzuan return to the immortal realm. The little clerk, 32, let out a joyful laugh and practically jumped a foot into the air. He was ecstatic, thinking to himself that from this day forward, he could truly consider himself Tianzuan's secretary. To be honest, he had been wanting to laugh out loud like this for quite some time. But in front of Tianzuan, he hadn't dared to be disrespectful, forcing himself to suppress that wild joy until the deity had departed. Now, unable to contain himself any longer, he put his hands on his hips and roared with laughter. Gao Jia also let out a sigh of relief, finally relaxing her tense posture and stretching out her limbs. She turned to the third lady beside her and complained about how heavy and thick the ceremonial suit felt. Maintaining such a heavily made-up face was, as we can imagine, an incredibly exhausting task. The third lady, however, could only look at her with an expression of pure envy. She told Gao Jia that while she envied her position deeply, the girl was doing nothing but complaining about the hard work. Gao Jia quickly clarified that she wasn't complaining, she simply wasn't used to the formality of it all yet. The third lady spoke with great seriousness, reminding her that as the holy maiden, she was responsible for Tianzuan's words. She explained that the more dignified her conduct remained, the more respect others would show toward Tianzuan. Gao Jia took the advice to heart, straightening her posture and trying her best to look the part. After that, the third lady turned her attention toward the clerk, 32. She called him a foolish old man, noting that the local villagers didn't seem to understand anything at all. So much time had passed, yet they still hadn't figured out how to properly do something in service of Tianzuan. She suggested they use their own savings to build a temple for Tianzuan, finally showing their true sincerity. 32 didn't hesitate for even a second, declaring that even if they had to go bankrupt and sell their last cooking pot, they would build that temple. However, he worried that in this village of Gao, even if they had the money, they might not actually be able to spend it. Meanwhile, although Li Daoxian had hidden himself within the clouds, we see that he hadn't actually left at all. He was still watching from the outside, having simply replaced the glass lid of the box to peer through the transparent surface. After several days of experimentation, he had discovered that if the lid was open, Gao Jie could see him appearing in the sky. But if he watched through the glass, not even Gao Jie could detect his presence. A very convenient trick, indeed. Humans are strange creatures. While watching in broad daylight is fine, there is a certain satisfaction in observing things in secret. And so he continued to watch Gao Jie, 32, and the others from his vantage point. The true nature they displayed once they believed the great deity had departed was, to be honest, quite fascinating to witness. As for building temples and sculpting statues, well, that was another matter entirely. Li Daoxian didn't think it was strictly necessary, but he figured if the little people enjoyed such tasks, he should let them proceed. There was no real need to intervene, as there were only about 40 people in the village to carry out these grand plans. Deep down, he knew they simply didn't have enough manpower to actually pull it off. He decided to see how they would manage, starting with 32 asking the villagers to bring out every oil tank and purple bottle they owned. Everyone went to fill them with rapeseed oil, and soon, every container in every household was brimming to the top. There was still a significant amount of oil left, so he organized the strongest young men to lift mineral water bottle caps together. Like a colony of ants transporting heavy treasures, they moved the remaining oil into their small, temporary storehouse. Next, it was time to process the massive pile of flour. The flour Li Daoxian had dropped into the box had clumped together into large, solid balls. 32 borrowed the village chief's stone mill and assigned 5 strong youths to grind those flour balls back into a fine powder so that it would look like ordinary flour, though Gao Chugu couldn't help but complain while he worked the mill. Uncle 32, why do we have to crush these again? He asked, clearly not seeing the point. He found the whole process quite troublesome, which earned him a swift smack on the forehead from 32. You know nothing. I have a plan, and if we don't do this, I can't use this flour to impress the outsiders and move our people. If anyone saw this flour in giant clumps, who knows what they'd think? It had to be ground into powder to keep up appearances. Gao Chugu argued clumsily that if government officials saw it, they could just say it was a gift from the celestial venerable. 32 gave him another smack, sighing at his nephew's lack of worldly wisdom. He reminded him that lately, the imperial court had been ruthlessly suppressing the White Lotus sect. In these times, anyone labeled a heretic or a demon is executed without a shred of mercy. To show up with flowers shaped like giant boulders and claim it came from a deity would be, well, a bit suspicious. It would be like asking for a death sentence. Really, Gao Chugu scratched his head, begging his uncle to stop hitting him. He joked that he was already foolish enough, and more blows to the head certainly wouldn't help his intellect. While Li Daoxian watched all this for his own entertainment, we see Gao Jie sitting under the eaves, clutching a book of Taoist classics. Li Daoxian watched with quiet amusement as Gao Jie studied the Taoist text with intense focus. As he struggled through the complex words, Gao Jie felt as though his head were growing twice its normal size from the effort. Even though he lacked the natural talent for recitation, he had absolutely no intention of backing down. Seeing the little people working so hard, Li Daoxian decided that he, too, should put in some effort for the sake of his own life. He decided to take on another small job, opening his work app to message his usual contact. Brother, do you have any work available these days? Send something my way, he wrote. The reply came back with a digital smile. I've been waiting for you. The assignment was a monster design for a gaming company, a fairly standard request in his line of work. The requirements were specific, a primary tone of black, something sinister and repulsive, the kind of thing that makes you shudder just looking at it. The pay was 800 yuan, with a deadline of just 2 days. Those 2 days flew by, and soon we see the twilight approaching as the sun began to set in the west. Li Daoxian stretched his arms, trying to relax his stiff muscles after the long hours of work. The client had just inspected the work and seemed relatively satisfied with the monster design he had created. However, there was a lingering feeling that perhaps he should add a pair of fangs to the creature. He added them as quickly as possible, hoping to wrap things up. But then the client decided the fangs were a bit too common, which is a classic move in the world of freelance. It would be better, they suggested, to swap them out for a long, trailing tongue. So, he dutifully added a long tongue to the monster's grimacing face. The client looked it over nervously, still not quite feeling it, and eventually decided the tongue needed sharp spines. And so, he shrunk the fangs and pasted them right onto the tongue instead. Finally, the client was satisfied, and Li Daoxian saw his savings grow by another 800 yuan. He had been so busy with work lately that he hadn't paid much attention to the little people inside the box. Now that the job was finished, he finally had a moment to see how they were faring. As soon as he turned his gaze back to the box, he discovered that 32 was leading a large, weary-looking group of people. As they passed through the city gates, he counted them. There were a total of 102 newcomers. The group scanned the towering walls of Gaojia village, appearing completely awestruck by what they saw. They entered the village timidly, standing in the central clearing while fidgeting nervously with their hands and feet. They had no idea where to put themselves, so 32 stood before the group and addressed them in a loud, clear voice. "Everything that needed to be said, I have already told you during our journey here," she began. "In short, by coming to Gaojia village, you won't lack a bite to eat, but I must give you the ugly truth first. After eating the food granted by the Heavenly Venerable, you must work for the Heavenly Venerable. You will do whatever it is the Heavenly Venerable wants you to do. Be obedient and do not be lazy or slack off, because if you do..." She paused on purpose, a mischievous, almost roguish smile playing on her lips, implying that losing their food would be the least of their worries. "If you anger the Heavenly Venerable, I will make you understand what it means for the heavens and the earth to turn upside down." Li Daoxian chuckled to himself, amused that she was threatening his beloved little toys by describing him as such a fierce deity. At that moment, the head of Gaojia village approached the group to see what was happening. 32 explained that these people were from Wangjia, Xinjia, and Zanjia villages, as well as several other surrounding settlements. Because Wang Er had rebelled and taken a large number of villagers with him, there were very few people left in those places. She had simply called out to them a few times, and they followed. Humans are social animals, after all. If a village's population shrinks past a certain point, the survivors simply cannot endure and are forced to move elsewhere. Originally, these peasants were tied to their land by tradition and law. This prevented them from wandering off, but after 3 long years of relentless drought, everything changed. The land is now useless, and a few people guarding a village of cracked yellow earth would only find death waiting for them.